Brienne of Tarth stood tall in the courtyard of the twins, her armored figure gleaming silver in the fading sun. The air was thick with tension and the acrid smell of river mud, horse sweat, and roasting meats. She had never before been within Walder Frey's walls, though she knew them to be a precarious place for any guest. Still, her sense of duty outweighed any lingering unease. She had promised Lady Catelyn Stark she would keep her safe. No, she had sworn it, the way she once swore her life for Renly Baratheon. This time, she intended to see the vow through, even if it meant standing alone against an entire hall of armed men. She kept her hand close to her sword's hilt, the comforting weight of Oathkeeper at her side, scanning the courtyard for any sign of hidden hostility. Men bustled about, carrying casks of ale, crates of bread, and trays laden with pies in preparation for the grand feast inside. There was chatter of music, dancing, celebration for Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey's wedding, but Brienne sensed a tension beneath it all. The Freys were not a warm family, not known for their hospitality in spirit, though they adhered to the letter of guest right. In the courtyard's far corner, a handful of young Frey men eyed her, whispering. One of them scoffed, sneering at the tall warrior woman in battered plate. She did not respond. She was used to such stares, such remarks. Instead, she waited, eyes scanning the parapets, the gates, the windows, any vantage point an archer might prefer. She would not let her guard drop, no matter how safe others presumed they were. Inside one of the towers, Lady Catelyn Stark stood in a small chamber, smoothing her gown with nervous hands. It was gray, edged with the silver of House Stark's colors, a subdued choice for what was intended to be a wedding feast. She had not the heart to don bright clothing, not when so much had gone wrong since her son declared the North's independence. And though she tried to mask her worry, her mind flickered between images of the past, Ned's head on a spike, the silent courtesy of King's Landing, and every step that had led them here. Her eldest son, Robb, was king in the North in name, but the war had worn them all down. The heartbreak of losing Winterfell, the constant threat from the Iron Throne, the betrayals, the uneasy alliances, Catelyn felt them all as a slow ache in her bones. She tried to breathe, reminding herself that this wedding was supposed to be a moment of healing, or at least a respite. Walder Frey's price for his alliance had been appeased with Edmure Tully's match to Rosalind Frey. It was done, sealed. Surely now there would be peace between House Stark and House Frey, if only outwardly. She prayed the gods would grant them some mercy. She glanced at the reflection in the polished metal mirror. Her auburn hair, woven into a simple braid, had more gray strands than the last time she dared truly look at herself. Her face was lined with sorrow and her mouth was pressed into a thin line. She wanted to be strong for Robb, who had lost so much already. She wanted to show him that his mother had faith in his decisions, that his father's spirit still guided them. With a final glance at her reflection, she turned to leave, footsteps echoing off the stone floors as she descended toward the great hall. Yet she paused at the threshold. Brienne, she called, half to herself, half to the corridor. The tall knight appeared moments later, as if summoned by the quiet voice. Brienne bowed her head respectfully. "My lady," she murmured, her voice resonating with a hushed determination. Even here, in the normally unremarkable hallways of the twins, Brienne carried herself with rigid alertness, blue eyes watchful. She, too, wore formal attire, if the dull gray-blue doublet beneath her armor could be called such. What truly mattered was her sword, always at her side, and the vow she had made to Catelyn to see her safely through these uncertain times. She had heard the rumors about Walder Frey's temperament, about the humiliations he had endured from Robb Stark, who had broken his promise to marry one of the Frey girls. A slighted pride was a dangerous thing, especially when nursing it in one's own stronghold. Though guest right was sacred, Brienne understood enough of the world to know that oaths and laws sometimes bent beneath ambition and grudges. Catelyn placed a gentle hand on Brienne's forearm. She was never entirely comfortable with the lumps of steel and leather that constituted the knight's armor, but its presence gave her comfort now. "Stay close," she said. "These Freys smile, but I cannot shake my worry." Brienne nodded. "I will, my lady. If there is trouble, we will face it." She allowed the faintest edge of fierceness to seep into her tone. Inside her chest, her heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She had endured the heartbreak of Renly's death and the scorn of King Stannis' court. She had faced the sneers and laughter of men all her life. She had come through it battered but unbroken, and she would not fail another oath. Honor was all she had. If Walder Frey's men tried to harm Lady Catelyn, they would have to go through her. They entered the hall, where trestle tables were laden with platters of steaming meat, warm bread, and golden harvest vegetables. The smell of roasted duck mingled with thick stews, pungent cheeses, and sweet wine. The lords and ladies gathered were in a celebratory mood, though the atmosphere felt more forced to Catelyn's eye. Musicians played a lively tune somewhere near the dais, where Walder Frey's high seat dominated the room. The aging lord of the crossing sat there, half-withered though cunning eyes still sparkled, surveying his domain. Catelyn noted how he barely disguised the derision in his glances toward Robb, who was seated not far from him at a place of distinction. Walder Frey had offered courtesies, but they were not genuine. Catelyn knew it. Still, they had to see this wedding through. They had to ensure House Frey remained an ally, no matter how tenuous or unpleasant that alliance might be. Robb looked weary as well. He offered a faint smile to his mother when she arrived, though she could see the fatigue pulling at the corners of his lips. Beside him stood his new wife, Jane Westerling, of the crumbling House Westerling. Brienne glanced at them, then immediately searched the hall, scanning each face, each corner, evaluating the mood. She saw Frey men at the edges, scurrying servers weaving through the crowded tables. The Frey brood was numerous. Sons, grandsons, daughters, cousins, all filling the seats, each with a face that bore some measure of the old man's features. They chatted, but their voices felt hushed beneath the music, and Brienne caught more than one sidelong look directed toward the Starks party. She allowed herself no illusions. They were not among friends. Even so, the initial courses passed without incident, and it seemed perhaps her wariness might have been for naught. Old Walder toasted to Edmure's happiness in a mocking but outwardly jovial tone. Wine was poured, bread was broken, an official sign of guest right, and a semblance of good humor filled the hall. Brienne remained a silent sentinel behind Lady Catelyn. She ate little herself, only a piece of bread and a cup of water, wishing to keep a clear mind and a light stomach in case she needed to fight. The music changed occasionally, from a fast jig to a slower melody, and dancing began in the middle of the hall. Women's gowns swirled in bright arcs, while men in doublets whirled them around. It was not the grand spectacle of a king's wedding, but it had its rustic charm. Yet every so often, Brienne noted the hush that fell among the minstrels. Their eyes darted toward Lord Walder, waiting for some secret cue. Something about the tension in the hall made her skin prickle with unease. She recalled rumors that House Frey had cunning and stealth in its tradition. She thought of how dangerous it would be if, indeed, the bread and salt meant nothing to them. The possibility clutched at her heart, but she stood firm. If danger showed itself, she would meet it with cold steel and determination. Near the dais, Catelyn watched Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey. The bride was quite pretty, with soft, timid features and wide eyes that seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. Edmure's expression was largely masked by forced joviality. He was making the best of it, but perhaps he shared his sister's sense of foreboding. However, as the feast wore on, he seemed to relax at least a little, particularly whenever Rosalind shot him a shy glance. And so courses were brought out, toast followed toast, and the music resumed. Some tension bled out of the air, replaced by a half-hearted festival air. Catelyn allowed herself a small exhale, though not enough to be at ease. She knew better than to trust these uncertain allies. Robb, for his part, tried to show courtesy. He sat straight-backed in his chair, responding politely to Walder Frey's pointed remarks, laughing when appropriate, nodding at references to the war and the heavy cost in men. He offered condolences for the Frey men lost. On the surface, it seemed to suffice. Still, in the brief moments they caught each other's eye, Catelyn could see the strain behind her son's calm facade. He knew how precarious the situation was. He had come with fewer men than normal, leaving others outside the castle or at different encampments, trusting in the sacredness of guest right. Yet something gnawed at them both, some intangible warning. But they had no choice now but to proceed. The wedding was official. Edmure and Rosalind were wed in front of the septon, and the hall roared with applause. Lord Walder clapped his bony hands and coughed out a sour grin, proclaiming the match sealed. In the swirl of that moment, Catelyn reached for her goblet, while Brienne's gaze swept the dais once more. When the moment was right, Walder Frey called for the bedding ceremony, that raucous tradition in which the bride was carried off by the men and the groom by the women to their wedding chamber. Catelyn had never been fond of it, but it was custom. Drunken lords lurched forward to hoist Edmure in the air, shouting ribald jokes and teasing, while others reached for Rosalind's delicate arms. The girl looked frightened. Catelyn pitied her. but she turned away, letting the custom unfold. She felt Brienne shift behind her. The tall knight radiated discomfort at the spectacle, though she, too, remained silent. Then Walder Frey raised his arm. The minstrels struck up a tune, one that danced ominously over the hall. It was an odd choice for a bedding ceremony, no joyful melody, but a slower, almost haunting refrain. Brienne's hand drifted closer to her sword hilt. She stood behind Catelyn, stepping slightly to the side to better position herself between her lady and the rest of the hall. At that moment, the first crossbow bolt flew. It hissed through the air, burying itself into the wooden pillar behind Robb Stark's chair. With a cry, someone shouted treachery. Immediately, chaos erupted. Freymen emerged from corners and behind curtains, crossbows loaded and aimed at the Starks and their allies. The minstrels discarded their instruments, revealing knives and short swords beneath their cloaks. Catelyn gasped, spinning around to see the glint of steel from the dais and from the far corners of the hall. Walder Frey had not moved from his seat, but his thin lips curled into a victorious sneer. Robb lurched forward, trying to reach for a sword that was resting against the table. Another crossbow bolt whizzed by, grazing his arm. He grunted in pain. Several of his men jumped up, but in the rush, crossbow bolts found their marks. Soldiers in Stark livery collapsed, crimson blossoming across their cloaks. Women screamed. A thick wave of panic swept over everything, drowning out the earlier laughter. Tables were overturned, plates crashed to the floor, and the smell of spilled wine mixed with the tang of fresh blood. Shouts echoed everywhere. Brienne reacted at once, thrusting Catelyn behind her, drawing Oathkeeper in a swift metallic rasp. She let out a battle cry that cut through the chaos like thunder. A Frey soldier lunged for Lady Catelyn, brandishing a mace. Brienne met him head-on, parrying with a fierce swipe. Her sword clanged against steel, reverberating through her arms, but she drove him back with a savage overhead cut that struck his collarbone. He went down in a heap, blood spreading across the straw-strewn floor. Catelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She scrambled for some semblance of safety, but there was nowhere safe in that hall. Crossbow bolts rained down from the upper galleries. She could see men in the livery of the twins reloading, aiming at Robb, at the Northmen, at any Tully bannermen they could. She heard Walder Frey's cackling voice, "Kill the wolf. Kill them all." The horror of betrayal seized Catelyn, but she refused to let despair devour her. Not again. She would not lose Robb the way she had lost Ned. She yelled for her son, her voice cracking with fear and rage. Robb had seized a shield from a fallen guard and tried to defend himself while also calling for his men to rally. But the ambush was so sudden, the Northmen so outnumbered. They were pinned down in the middle of the hall, drunken from feasting, and caught without their armor. What could they do but fight? Brienne waded into the chaos with grim purpose. She moved like a warhammer crashing through glass, unstoppable in her fury. Her every blow was meant to protect Catelyn, to clear a path. She cut down another Frey who lunged with a spear. The crowd churned around them, terrified servants, squealing ladies, stumbling men. Roose Bolton, the lord of the Drefort, was among the crowd, and though he wore Stark colors at the moment, his cold eyes betrayed nothing of loyalty. His expression was unreadable, and Brienne did not trust him. She remembered the rumors that Bolton men flayed their enemies. But in that instant, he did not move against Robb, nor did he move to help. Catelyn ducked as a crossbow bolt whizzed by her head. She grabbed a fallen dagger from beneath one of the tables that would slick with overturned gravy and blood. She had never been comfortable with a blade, but desperation lent her strength. If she was to die here, she would not die without a fight. Another Frey soldier, short and broad across the shoulders, rushed her. Brienne interposed her blade, but the man sidestepped her, lunging toward Catelyn with a savage grin. Catelyn lashed out wildly with her dagger, catching him across the cheek. He yowled, staggering back into Brienne's sweeping strike. His body thudded to the floor, limp, while a wave of relief and nausea hit Catelyn at once. She had killed before. On that fateful day Renly died, her knife had taken the life of a would-be assassin, but each time it shook her to her core. The hall was a swirling madness of screams, steel, and blood. Yet, even amid the carnage, Brienne sensed an opening. Many Freys had turned their weapons on the main cluster of Stark men near Robb, who was desperately trying to survive. She shouted to Catelyn, "My lady, we must move. We can't stay here." She ducked another bolt, the iron tip screeching off her pauldron. She gritted her teeth at the impact. Catelyn wanted to reach Robb, to save him, but more Freys closed in, pressing between them like a writhing knot of armed bodies. "Robb," she screamed. Her son glanced over at her, eyes wild, red with fury, fear, and heartbreak. He tried to cut his way toward her, but more crossbowmen lined up. One bolt struck his shield, another tore through a retainer next to him, sending blood spraying across the dais steps. He yelled for his men, but too many of them were unarmed, having left their weapons outside as part of Walder Frey's demands for peace talks. The ones who did carry blades had been well into their cups when the fight began, slowed and confused by the suddenness of the attack. Brienne seized Catelyn's arm, her voice urgent. "If we stay put, we die." She could see a route through a side door near the dais, though it was guarded by a pair of Freymen with halberds. If she could defeat them, she might spirit Catelyn away to safety. In any normal battle, Brienne would have considered the difference in numbers, but she had no choice here. The only thing that mattered was preserving Catelyn's life. And Catelyn, for her part, did not resist. She followed Brienne, stumbling over corpses and spilled food, hearing the shrieks of wounded men. She clutched the dagger in her hand, numb and terrified. Around them, the music had ended. It was replaced by the wet sounds of steel in flesh, the choking cries of the dying, and the triumphant shrieks of the ambushers. Lord Walder himself seemed more gleeful than alarmed, content to watch the slaughter from his vantage point. On his command, archers continued loosing bolts into the fray. Brienne felt each heartbeat like a thunderclap, each breath a raw gulp. She reached the two halberdiers by the side door. With a snarl, she brought her sword up. The first swung the heavy blade of his weapon down at her shoulder. She was quick, raising her own blade to meet it, absorbing the brunt of the blow in her angled steel. The clash nearly jarred her arms numb, but she gritted her teeth. Before the Frey could pull back, she shoved him aside with brute strength, slamming the pommel of her sword into his face. He stumbled, blood spurting from his nose. The second halberdier thrust forward, the spear-like tip aiming for her midsection. She twisted, the metal scraping against her breastplate, and responded with a sweeping slash at his legs. He crumpled with a scream, giving Brienne enough time to finish the first man with a lunge through his mail shirt. She spat a curse, wrenched her sword free, and kicked the door open. Catelyn, trembling, followed her through. They entered a narrow corridor lit by flickering torchlight. The noise of slaughter receded only slightly as they put distance between themselves and the great hall. "We have to get to Robb," Catelyn managed, her voice tight with desperation. "He's still in there." Brienne's jaw tensed. "If we charge back in, we'll be cut down. We need another way," she thought as quickly as she could. They were in the Twins, a confusing fortress with winding corridors and multiple towers. She had memorized some of the layout, but not all. She had been determined from the start to note where the gates and the exits lay. One corridor led to the kitchens, another to the outer yard, and from there, possibly an escape. But what of Robb, still pinned down? She felt the conflict tearing at her. She was sworn to protect Catelyn, but how could she leave Robb to his fate? Catelyn felt that same war inside her. She clutched at Brienne's armored arm. "We must help him," she insisted, tears swimming in her eyes. "He's my son, Brienne." Brienne swallowed, remembering her vow. Not just to protect Catelyn, but to serve the House Stark cause. "We will find a way," she promised in a hoarse whisper. "But if we die in the attempt, then neither of you will be saved. Come." She led Catelyn down the corridor. The stone was cold underfoot and shouts echoed from behind them. Twice they almost ran into patrols of Freymen surging to join the slaughter. Each time, they ducked around corners or into alcoves. In the second such instance, Brienne had to silence a wounded Stark soldier they found sprawled against the wall, his guts leaking through his torn gambeson. He moaned for help and Catelyn paused, desperate to aid him, but the Frey patrol was too close. Brienne clamped a hand over his mouth, her eyes full of sorrow. As the footsteps thundered past. The moment they were gone, Catelyn knelt by the soldier. He was fading quickly, blood trickling from his lips. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears falling as she realized he was too far gone to save. He reached up feebly and she took his hand. Within a few heartbeats, his grip slackened. She closed his eyes. The grim necessity and horror of it shook her, but Brienne urged her onward. Every second counted. They reached a small postern gate that opened onto a narrow walkway above the river. Brienne tested it, found it locked. She cursed under her breath. She had no key and there was no time to search for one. She slammed into the door once, twice with her shoulder. The wood groaned but held. She used the pommel of her sword to attack the latch, determined to break it. Catelyn stood guard, though her dagger hand trembled. Finally, the latch gave way with a splintering crack and the door swung open. A biting night wind swept in, carrying the smell of the tumblestone and the distant rotting reeds. They spilled out onto the walkway, a narrow strip with a sheer drop to the swirling waters far below. There was only dim moonlight to guide them now, the towers of the Twins looming overhead, merging with the night sky. Brienne scanned the yard, trying to gauge if there was a path back around to rescue Robb. They could see torches inside the main keep's windows, the flicker of movement, the faint sounds of fighting. The keep's gates were closed tight. No doubt the phrase had locked everything down once the ambush began. She felt a stabbing despair. Inside that hall, Robb and the Northmen were being slaughtered. The vow to protect him warred with her vow to keep Catelyn safe. If they charged back in, they'd be overwhelmed. Tears threatened to rise in Brienne's eyes, but she blinked them away, scowling at her own helplessness. Catelyn, as though sensing Brienne's thoughts, gripped the stone balustrade. "We can't run," she said, voice quivering with anguish. "I won't. Robb is my son." She looked at Brienne with a fierce maternal determination. "If we abandon him, then what was the point of any of this? I'd rather die at his side than live knowing I fled." Brienne felt her heart twist. She admired Catelyn's courage. "My lady," she began carefully, "if you go back in there unarmored, you will almost certainly die. I would do anything to keep you both safe, but we must be wise." Catelyn closed her eyes. Her chest heaved with sorrow. "He may already be dead." The words slipped out like a choked whisper, and the possibility nearly undid her. The wind ruffled her braid, and a sob tore from her throat. Why would Fry do this? After all the talk of alliances, the bread and salt, how could he betray us so completely? Brienne had no answer, only the knowledge that men with wounded pride or cunning ambition were capable of great treachery. She placed a trembling hand on Catelyn's shoulder. "We'll find him. Perhaps we can circle back through another entry. I recall seeing a separate tower entrance from the yard." Her mind raced. If they skirted the outer wall, they might enter through the other tower where the wedding ceremonies had taken place, possibly re-emerge into the feast hall from a different angle. It was risky, but so was standing out here, exposed on the walkway. Torchlight glimmered on the rampart above them. Brienne gestured for Catelyn to stay low, pressing themselves against the cold stone. A pair of Fry guards patrolled overhead, scanning the darkness. "We should get off this walkway," Brienne whispered. She guided Catelyn along, each step precarious on the slick stones. Water crashed below, the river swirling with dark, lethal force. If one misstep was taken, they would plunge into that cold blackness. But they had no choice. The walkway wound around the tower, leading to a narrow platform near a side entrance. Brienne tested the door. This time it was open, though an iron gate blocked immediate passage. Beyond the bars, she heard the clang of distant fighting. She could see torchlight flickering in a corridor. Gritting her teeth, she pulled at the iron bars. They would not budge. Catelyn pressed her face to the gap, peering in. She glimpsed a group of Stark soldiers down a hallway cornered by a throng of Fry men. The soldiers fought valiantly but were clearly outnumbered. Her breath caught. She recognized some of them, men loyal to her house. She wanted to call out, but Brienne clamped a hand over her mouth and shook her head. The frays were too numerous. Suddenly, a crossbow bolt pinged off the stone mere inches from Brienne's helmet. She ducked, dragging Catelyn behind the partial cover of the stone arch. "They've spotted us," she hissed. Far along the walkway, a Fry guard was reloading his crossbow, cursing under his breath. Another bolt thudded into the stone, sending shards of rock flying. They had nowhere to go but back. "Run," Brienne urged, her voice thick with adrenaline. They scrambled back around the tower, flattening themselves against the cold surface, hoping to escape the crossbowman's line of sight. The walkway was narrow, leaving little room for maneuver. Another bolt struck the balustrade, lodging there with a shiver of vibrating wood. Catelyn's entire body felt like a drum under assault, her heart pounding. "We'll be trapped," she managed. Brienne's mind raced. They were pinned between the crossbowmen and the yard full of frays. The only solace was the darkness of night, which afforded them some cover. A thought struck Brienne: if they could find a spot directly beneath the archers, the crossbow bolts would have less chance of hitting them. She guided Catelyn, half-crouched, to a point below the guard who was struggling to line up a shot. Stone jutted out overhead, forming a partial overhang. The guard's curses echoed above as he tried to catch sight of them. Brienne took the opportunity to weigh their next move. They could not simply wait. More guards would come. She spotted a drainage gutter or a narrow window that opened into some chamber. It was high up, but with her height, perhaps she could boost Catelyn inside. She pointed to it, leaning close to Catelyn so she could be heard. "We might climb through there. It could lead inside, somewhere safer than here. Do you trust me?" Catelyn nodded, voice lost to the thunder of her pulse. Carefully, Brienne sheathed her sword, then positioned herself beneath the window. She interlocked her hands and coaxed Catelyn to place her foot in them. With a small grunt, Brienne hoisted her up. Catelyn reached for the window ledge, slippery with moisture, but managed to find a grip. It took all her strength to pull herself through the narrow opening. She scraped her arm on the rough stone, hissing with pain, but made it inside. Then she turned, extending a hand down for Brienne. Brienne jumped, grasping the ledge with her gauntlet fingers. Catelyn strained, trying to help pull her up, but she lacked the strength to lift the tall, armored knight. Brienne's boots scrambled on the wall, seeking purchase. Another crossbow bolt flew overhead, clanging against the stone. She grunted and forced herself up with a burst of effort, arms trembling from the strain of hoisting her body weight in full armor. Catelyn dug her heels in, leaning back to add what little leverage she could. At last, with a powerful heave, Brienne tumbled inside, landing on the floor with a clang of metal. They lay there panting for a moment, hearts roaring in their ears. When Brienne finally looked around, she saw they were in a small storage room stacked with crates of salted fish and some sacks of flour. The walls were damp and a single torch sputtered on a sconce by the door. Carefully, Brienne rose, drawing her sword once more. Catelyn stood, shaky but resolute, holding her dagger. The door was slightly ajar, leading into a dim corridor. They could hear voices from somewhere beyond. With a silent nod, Brienne took the lead, pushing the door open with her sword point. The corridor was empty for the moment, but shouts rang through the fortress and the floor was littered with rushes and scraps of cloth. They ventured forth carefully, guided only by the flickering torches. At an intersection, they turned toward the direction of the Great Hall, hoping somehow to reach Robb or at least discover his fate. At one point, they encountered two Fremen dragging a bleeding Stark soldier by his arms. The soldier looked barely conscious, leaving a smear of red behind him. The Freys froze upon spotting Brienne and Catelyn. For a heartbeat, both sides stared, stunned. Then Brienne surged forward, sword raised. One Frey dropped the soldier and swung his axe. Brienne deflected it with a clang and countered, hacking deep into his side. The man gurgled and collapsed. The other Frey abandoned his captive, backing away in alarm. Catelyn stepped in, brandishing her dagger clumsily. But her resolve shone, and the Frey panicked. He turned to flee. Brienne let him go, not wanting to be cornered here. Instead, she crouched by the wounded Stark soldier, pressing fingers to his neck. He was breathing barely. Eyes fluttering, he gazed at them. His lips moved, but no words emerged, only blood. Brienne felt a pang of helplessness. He was dying. Catelyn's face twisted with anguish. The soldier's eyes pleaded for mercy, though what could they do? They had no maester, no bandages. Even if they did, there was no time. Catelyn whispered a prayer to the old gods, placing a hand on his brow. He exhaled once, and then he was gone. A ragged sob escaped Catelyn, but Brienne guided her on. Each corner they turned, the sense of dread deepened. The fortress was in utter chaos. Doors were kicked in, bodies strewn about. Blood soaked the stones. Brienne spotted more Frey men butchering helpless servants who wore Stark livery, ignoring pleas for mercy. The betrayal was total. She felt fury welling within her. Was this the price of Robb Stark's broken promise? That his entire family and retinue would be butchered? At last, they found a staircase leading up toward the Great Hall's gallery. They ascended in tense silence. At the top, they peered through an archway, finding themselves on a balcony overlooking the hall. The scene below was one of nightmares. Bodies lay strewn across the rushes and broken tables. Blood stained everything. The music had stopped, replaced by pained groans. A handful of Frey guards stalked among the dead, finishing off the wounded. Lord Walder, that wrinkled old spider, still presided from his seat, looking quite pleased. Catelyn scanned the carnage, searching desperately for Robb. A fresh wave of anguish choked her as she saw men wearing the direwolf sigil lying motionless. Brienne's gaze swept the hall. Her eyes found a cluster of fighting men near the dais. 3 or 4 Northmen still on their feet, defending themselves with desperation. And there, in the middle, was Robb Stark. Blood dripped from a wound in his shoulder, and his face was grim. But he was alive, brandishing a sword in one hand, a small shield in the other. He was in open combat with Roose Bolton, who had cast off any pretense of loyalty, wearing mail beneath his Stark colors. Bolton sneered, every thrust methodical. Robb was clearly weakening. One of the Northmen tried to intervene, but a crossbow bolt claimed him, and he fell to the floor. Brienne felt Catelyn tremble beside her. "He lives," she said under her breath, voice trembling with hope. "My son still lives." Bolton lunged, and Robb parried, though the blow nearly knocked the sword from his hand. Walder Frey laughed. "The king in the north bleeds like any other man," he jeered. From the corner of the hall, a cluster of Frey men reloaded their crossbows, aiming for Robb. This would be the end, Brienne realized in horror. Once they fired, Robb would be finished no matter how valiantly he fought. Catelyn let out a strangled cry, gripping the balcony rail as if she might vault over. Without hesitation, Brienne locked eyes with her lady. No words were needed. They both knew the risk. They both knew that if they did nothing, Robb would die. Brienne took a breath, then sprang into action. She sprinted along the balcony, searching for a quick way down. Spotting a smaller set of stairs that led to the floor near the dais, she rushed down them, Catelyn following behind, the older woman's adrenaline fueling her legs. A cry of alarm rose from the hall below as Freymen spotted them. Brienne was on them before they could loose their bolts at Robb. She tore into their flank like a tempest, her sword a flashing arc of steel. One crossbowman gasped as she slammed him aside. Another managed to squeeze the trigger, his bolt clipping Brienne's upper arm, drawing blood. She winced but did not falter. Her blade came down in a mighty stroke, cutting him down. Two more rushed her with swords and she blocked, parrying one blade while spinning away from the other. She moved with lethal grace, stepping inside their guard to strike. Blood splashed across her boots. Catelyn, meanwhile, spotted a dagger lying on the floor near a lifeless soldier. She scooped it up, ignoring the gore. She advanced on a crossbowman who was fumbling to reload. Though she had little skill in combat, she drew upon the raw force of maternal rage. The man raised his arms to shield himself, but she stabbed wildly, screaming for all the grief, terror, and fury in her heart. He cried out, dropping to his knees. She twisted the blade free, panting. Every nerve in her body was on fire, but she would not let her son die here. At the dais, Robb was locked in a deadly dance with Roose Bolton. Bolton lunged again, slicing a shallow cut across Robb's ribs. Robb hissed in pain, staggering. He tried to raise his shield, but his battered arm trembled from exhaustion and injury. The carnage around them had ended with nearly all the Northmen lying in pools of crimson. Frey archers began to turn their attention toward Brienne and Catelyn. "Shoot them," Lord Walder snarled. "Shoot them now." But the crossbows had to be reloaded carefully, and the men who might have done so lay dead or dying. Some still moved to obey, fumbling to crank the bows. Brienne, in the thick of it, saw the threat. She knocked a table over as cover, seizing a heavy wooden chair to hurl at one archer before he could shoot. The hall was chaos incarnate. She roared, "Your Grace," to Robb, drawing his gaze. He looked at her with stunned relief, but he could not spare a second more. Bolton was relentless. Brienne pivoted, shouldering aside two Frey men who tried to block her path. She heard Catelyn scream, "Robb," and saw Lady Stark rushing forward, ignoring the blood that slicked the floor. Walder Frey watched with outrage. "Stop them," he shouted. Bolton caught sight of Brienne's approach. He hissed interference and attempted a vicious slash at Robb's kneecap, which Robb barely dodged. Brienne closed the distance, swinging a blow toward Bolton's side. He parried, but the force drove him back a step. Robb took the opportunity to strike. His sword raked across Bolton's arm, eliciting a snarl. For a moment, it seemed that the tide might turn. Then, from behind Bolton, several more Frey men converged. One thrust a spear at Robb's back. Brienne acted without thought, lunging between them. The spear point scraped her armor, cutting a shallow groove in her side. Pain lanced through her, but she refused to fall. She battered the spear away and hewed the attacker down with a savage chop. Catelyn reached Robb, tears streaming down her face. "We must go," she shouted. He was half in shock, blood seeping from multiple wounds. His eyes flicked between his mother, Brienne, and the ring of Frey men. Another crossbow bolt flew, shattering a wine pitcher on the table. Walder Frey's outraged voice echoed, "Finish them off." Bolton glared at Brienne, eyes cold as the grave. "You will pay for your interference, woman." She gritted her teeth. "Try me." Their blades met with a clash. Bolton was cunning, stepping aside to let the Frey men close in. Brienne felt a flicker of panic. They could not hold out much longer against so many. They needed to escape now or die. Robb, spurred by his mother's pleas, felt like a cornered wolf. With renewed vigor, he hacked at a Frey man who lunged, then pivoted to strike another who threatened Catelyn. Blood spattered his face. "Mother," he gasped, panting, how he couldn't even form the question. He was too winded, too overwhelmed. She only clutched his arm, sobbing in relief to see him alive. Brienne slashed at a crossbowman's legs, sending him tumbling. Over her shoulder she shouted, "We must flee. We cannot fight them all." Robb glanced around, saw the carnage, realized the truth. He nodded grimly. There would be no victory here. Their only hope was survival. Catelyn pointed toward the side corridor from which Brienne and she had emerged. This way, she cried, but it was already teeming with Frey reinforcements. Walder Frey had orchestrated the ambush too well. They were surrounded. Bolton raised his sword to deliver a decisive blow at Brienne, but Robb interceded, crossing steel with him. Their blades locked. Bolton sneered. "Traitors deserve this end," he hissed. "The North will bend to the Iron Throne at last, and you are a fool boy who lost his crown." Before he could strike, a sudden outcry from the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of Stark men had forced their way in, perhaps hearing the commotion or discovering treachery late. They poured into the hall with weapons raised, letting out a resounding war cry. Dozens of them flooded in, led by Great John Umber, who bellowed like an enraged bull. For the king in the north. The unexpected reinforcements tore into the Frey men from behind, splitting their ranks. Bolton cursed, stepping back, forced to turn to defend himself. Robb, Catelyn, and Brienne seized that moment. They retreated from the dais, regrouping with the newly arrived Northmen. A swirling melee erupted, the Freys caught between two fronts, Robb's small group near the dais and Umber's men by the main doors. Walder Frey shrieked, "Close the gates, you fools. Don't let them in." But it was too late. The Great John hacked down the guards at the door, letting more Stark soldiers stream into the hall. Brienne shielded Catelyn while Robb tried to maintain enough composure to lead. Blood-drenched his surcoat. He stumbled and Catelyn cried out, catching him. "Robb, stay with me." Freed from Bolton's assault, Brienne scanned the hall for an escape route. With the reinforcements, they might actually cut their way out. Or, if they managed to rally more men, perhaps they could seize Walder Frey himself. But no, the older man was guarded by a fresh wave of Frey men at the dais, crossbows at the ready. The hall reeked of death, and the battered Northmen were in no condition to press an attack. "Out!" Brienne shouted to those who would listen. "We must get out." Through the swirling chaos, a path opened momentarily as the Great John and his men battered the Freys aside. Robb, leaning on his mother, forced himself to move. His left arm hung useless, wet with blood, but his eyes were still alive with fury and the will to survive. "Forward!" he roared, voice ragged. "We'll regroup in the yard." The Northmen began to pull back, step by bloody step, while the Freys harried them. Crossbow bolts sang overhead, claiming more lives. Umber cursed as one of his banner men fell, but he pressed on. Walder Frey's furious shrieking was lost in the thunder of clashing blades. At last, Brienne forced open a side door, letting in a rush of cold night air. Stark soldiers poured out, half carrying their wounded. The Great John shoved a Nael Frey aside, kicking him into a table, then followed. Brienne and Catelyn helped Robb stumble through the doorway into the night. Once outside, they saw that the yard had erupted in violence as well. Frey men fought pockets of Northmen who had not yet realized the magnitude of the treachery. Some Stark soldiers tried to hold the stables, others fought near the outer gate. The walls bristled with Frey archers. The plan to destroy the Stark host was well coordinated indeed. But the Northmen had not entirely been caught unawares. Some were still encamped beyond the castle, or had come looking for their king when they heard strange noises. Enough had forced their way in to disrupt Walder Frey's plan of a clean slaughter. Brienne stayed by Catelyn's side as they ran, half-crouched, across the yard, Robb sagging between them. A volley of arrows pelted the ground, one embedding itself in a fallen cart. A horse lay dead nearby, riddled with arrows, its eyes wide and glassy. Cries of agony rose from all around, and the flicker of torches lit the chaotic scene with lurid orange light. The Great John roared instructions. "To the gates!" He and his men led the charge, cutting a swath through the Frey defenders. The gates were partially closed, but not fully barred. A wedge of Northmen battered into them, pushing aside the few Freys attempting to seal it. Eventually, with a mighty heave, the Great John and his men forced the gates open enough for bodies to slip through. Walder Frey's voice rang out from above, his thin figure visible on the ramparts. "Stop them! Don't let the wolf escape!" More arrows rained down, but the Northmen poured out of the gates, desperation lending them strength. Robb, his wounds severe, stumbled. Brienne hoisted him onto her shoulder with a grunt, ignoring her own pain. Catelyn limped beside them, face streaked with tears. She and Robb had both lost everything but each other in that moment. Once beyond the gates, they found the open field, where more Stark soldiers waited in confusion, hearing the din but unsure of what had transpired. The Great John bellowed for them to form up, to protect their wounded king. A ragged circle formed, bristling with spears and swords. Eyes turned warily to the fortress walls. Bolton's banners were nowhere to be seen out here. Presumably, the treacherous lord remained within, orchestrating with Walder Frey. Robb sank to his knees on the grass, breathing heavily. His blood-soaked surcoat glistened in the torchlight. Catelyn cried out, dropping beside him, pressing a hand to the wound at his shoulder. "Help him!" She pleaded to no one in particular, half-dazed. A kindly soldier knelt to assess the wound, but it was a dire situation. Brienne stood over them, sword in hand, scanning the walls for another onslaught. She felt the burn of her own injuries, though adrenaline kept her upright. The Great John approached, battered but alive, standing like a tower of muscle. "Your Grace," he said, voice thick with worry. "What do we do now?" Robb's face was ashen, his jaw clenched. We retreat," he managed, tears of fury and humiliation shining in his eyes. "Frey must pay, but we can't fight them all now." He coughed, spitting blood. His face contorted with pain. Is my mother, safe?" Catelyn cradled his head in her lap, nodding through her tears. "I'm here, Robb. I'm here." She looked at Brienne, words failing her. Brienne knelt, bowing her head, exhaustion crushing her. "My lady, we must get him to a maester. Or a surgeon. He won't last otherwise." Catelyn nodded frantically, stroking Robb's hair. The Great John barked orders to mount up to carry the wounded. Some horses had been spared outside the castle, though many were panicked by the clamor. The Northmen who remained swiftly organized a rough retreat. The watchers on the twins' walls fired arrows, but distance and darkness made their aim poor. In the confusion, the battered remnants of the Stark forces began to withdraw, carrying their wounded king with them. Brienne helped lift Robb onto a horse, supporting him. Catelyn rode beside him, refusing to leave his side. They departed from the twins under the pale moonlight, the fortress behind them echoing with screams and the rancid stench of betrayal. Only once they were well away from the arrow's range did some measure of quiet descend. Robb slumped in the saddle, eyes half-lidded. A soldier guided his reins. Catelyn held onto his arm, speaking softly to keep him conscious. "Stay with me, Robb. Stay." Brienne rode slightly behind, scanning the darkness for pursuers. The night felt long and haunted. They had narrowly escaped a massacre that had claimed so many Stark lives. Even still, the burden of what had happened weighed heavily on them all. Walder Frey's betrayal might well break the Northern War effort, and the news would spread like wildfire once day broke. The king in the north nearly slain at his uncle's wedding feast. Hundreds of loyal men cut down under the false banner of peace. Yet in that darkest hour, something precious remained. Robb Stark was still alive. Catelyn Stark was still alive. Together, they could still fight another day, seek justice, or at least survive to mourn the fallen. And Brienne of Tarth, though bloodied and wounded, had kept her oath. She had protected Lady Catelyn. She had helped save the king in the north from immediate death. The cost had been unimaginable, but her vow still stood. And so they rode through the night, battered and grieving, guided by flickering torches and the unwavering hope that in living they might find a chance to avenge those lost and reclaim honor from the ashes of betrayal. By dawn's first light, the survivors halted in a small copse of trees by the banks of the Green Fork. The smell of damp leaves and river water enveloped them. Men who had once boasted of their battle prowess slumped in exhaustion, their faces hollow. The Great John and a few other lords tried to organize a makeshift camp. Lookouts were posted. Tents were raised quickly while the wounded were laid on blankets or cloaks. Catelyn refused to leave Robb's side. Brienne stood at the perimeter, sword in hand, scanning the horizon. They had no illusions that Walder Frey or Bolton might come for them, but for the moment no pursuit was visible. The men were exhausted, the night's bloodshed etched on every face. The stench of dried gore clung to them, their boots, their cloaks. More than a few wept in despair or coughed from injuries. An acrid mix of sorrow and bitterness hung in the cool morning air. Robb was placed in a tent. A veteran soldier with some knowledge of wound care knelt by him, applying a poultice and bandages. Catelyn hovered, tears drying into silent determination. He was alive, but not well. Fever might set in, the wounds could fester without proper care. She clutched his hand, her mind raging with guilt. She'd arranged the wedding. She had tried to salvage the alliance. She'd misjudged Walder Frey. Each time Robb stirred in pain, she felt it like a dagger in her own heart. Yet she knew blame would not help him recover. She forced herself to stand, to think of the next steps. They had so few men left, so little hope. But they had life, and that must be enough for now. Outside the tent, the great John cornered Brienne. He towered over her, his beard matted with blood, some his own, some from enemies. His voice rumbled, "My lady knight. You saved them. I saw it." He spoke not with scorn but with gratitude. "If you hadn't gone in, they'd both be dead. You did what half our men could not." Brienne felt her cheeks flush. "I only did my duty," she muttered. I wish I had done more. So many died." Her voice caught. She remembered the lifeless eyes of Stark bannermen in the hall, the final pleas and the betrayal. She struggled to quell the surge of grief and anger. Honor demanded she stay strong for Catelyn's sake. The great John clapped her on the shoulder with surprising gentleness, though his large hand still jarred her bruises. "Aye, many died, but the king in the north yet lives. Lady Stark yet lives. That was no small feat." He paused, glancing toward the tent. "We'll get a maester soon enough. One rides with our baggage train to the east. If we can reach them, maybe the king will survive." Brienne nodded. She let out a shaky breath. "We should move again soon, once the men are rested. We're too close to the frays here. They could ride out at dawn." The great John agreed, though they both knew the men were too battered to travel far without at least a few hours' respite. Guards were posted with instructions to raise an alarm at any sign of fry riders. Brienne took a moment to clean her sword at a nearby stream. The water ran red as she washed away the gore. She examined her injuries, scrapes, bruises, and a shallow puncture in her side. Pain flared once the battle high ebbed, but she grit her teeth, binding it with a spare strip of cloth. She'd endured worse. Back at the tent, she found Catelyn sitting outside on a low stool, head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Brienne approached carefully, removing her gauntlets. She rested a hand lightly on Catelyn's shoulder. "My lady." Catelyn did not raise her head. "They're gone," she whispered. "So many of our men. Fry lured us into his trap like lambs. I keep seeing their faces." Her voice cracked. "I keep hearing the laughter in that hall moments before the slaughter. And my brother Edmure, I don't know if he survived. The last I saw, he was taken to be bedded with Rosalind. But the entire keep must be drenched in blood by now. Gods help him." Brienne's expression softened. "We can't know his fate yet, my lady. Perhaps he is captive, or he escaped. We'll do what we can to find out." She swallowed. She wanted to offer comfort, but words felt so hollow. She knelt, stoic, but her eyes were full of compassion. "We are alive. Your son is alive. That is not nothing." Catelyn nodded numbly, pressing her lips together in an effort to maintain composure. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you for that. You saved us both." Brienne shook her head. "I only wish I could have saved more." They lapsed into silence, the unspoken weight of guilt and grief heavy in the air. The day crawled forward, with the men resting in shifts, always wary of attack. But no Fry riders appeared. Perhaps Walder Fry was content to let them flee, believing them broken. Perhaps Bolton had other plans. In any case, the survivors used the time to tend wounds and bury the worst of them who had died in the night. By late afternoon, enough horses had been gathered to transport the wounded. With the Grachan's urging, the column formed up, a pitiful remnant of the once proud northern host. Robb was carried on a litter by 4 soldiers, drifting in and out of consciousness. They set off along the river road, the wind rustling the tall grasses. Brienne rode beside Catelyn, who refused to be parted from her son. Both women were grim and determined. In the distance, thunderheads loomed, hinting at a coming storm. A fitting omen, Catelyn thought, for what they had just endured. With each step away from the twins, she felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief to have escaped that dreadful place, horror at the memory of its treachery. She could not banish the images of her men dying around her. The smug leer of Walder Fry, the mocking vow of hospitality turned into a bloodbath. But she would not surrender. Too much rested on her survival, on Robb's survival. She thought of her daughters, lost in the south, of her younger sons, rumored dead or missing. Grief was a part of her now, but so was purpose. Walder Fry would answer for this, she vowed silently, as would all who betrayed them. For days, they journeyed up the river, heading toward the eastern roads, hoping to meet the baggage train and the maester traveling with it. Scouts rode ahead, searching for signs of the Bolton forces or Fry riders. Each time the scouts returned, they brought only vague reports of scattered movement, nothing definitive. That in itself was worrying. The north was rife with foes now, or uncertain allies at best. They found small villages abandoned, hearing rumors that men loyal to the Iron Throne had raised them. Occasionally, they encountered frightened peasants who hid until the battered Stark banners convinced them that the rumored slaughter at the Twins had not killed all of the northern force. Robb's condition teetered on a knife's edge. The fever rose at night, leaving him delirious, calling out for Grey Wind, for his wife Jane, for his father. Catelyn stayed by him, bathing his brow, murmuring reassurances through her own tears. Brienne took on guard shifts, rarely sleeping more than a few hours. She would stand at the perimeter of their meager camp, scanning the dark horizon, haunted by the memory of that feast-turned-funeral. She tried to hold on to hope that they could continue, that Robb would recover, that some measure of justice remained in this world. Her vow to Catelyn still bound her like iron. She would not let her lady face any more horrors alone. When at last they caught up with the baggage train, the maester, a stooped man with wispy white hair named Colin, hurried to Robb's side, applying stronger poultices, stitching the deeper wounds, administering herbs to fight the infection. The entire camp held its breath, waiting to see if their king in the north would awaken with clarity. Days passed. Brienne watched with bated breath as Catelyn paced anxiously outside the tent, weeping silent tears or praying to the old gods. The Greyjohn spent long hours conferring with the other remaining northern lords, debating their next move. Some argued they should return north at once, defend their homelands from whatever new threats might emerge. Others insisted on regrouping with loyal riverlords. But the riverlords had been shaken by the Tully seat's loss of power. The phrase had Edmure, or so they believed. The region might be compromised. No easy answers surfaced. One evening, a hush fell over the camp as Maester Colin emerged from Robb's tent, face drawn but hopeful. "He's awake, my lady," he told Catelyn. "He asks for you." She rushed inside, Brienne close behind. Robb lay propped up on pillows, his eyes glassy but conscious. Color had returned to his cheeks, and the shallow rise and fall of his chest no longer seemed so labored. Catelyn's relief manifested as soft sobs. She took his hand gently. "My boy," she whispered. "You're safe." Robb's voice came out hoarse. "Mother, you lived?" He glanced around, confusion knitting his brows. The memory of the betrayal must have been flooding back. His gaze landed on Brienne, standing in the corner, sword at her hip. He blinked as though piecing it together. "You saved me, both of you," he rasped. "I owe you my life." Brienne bowed her head. "Your Grace, I only did my duty to your lady mother. I am glad you live." Robb swallowed, wincing as the movement tugged at his bandaged wounds. He forced himself to speak, though each word cost him. "My men, so many dead?" Catelyn nodded tearfully. "I'm sorry, Robb. We lost most who were inside the hall." His eyes slid shut as the weight of that truth pressed down on him. He shuddered with guilt and rage. "Walder Frye," he murmured. "I should have seen it coming. I should never have trusted him." Catelyn smoothed his hair. "We'll make him pay," she whispered, though how she did not know. In the following weeks, Robb slowly regained strength under the maester's care. Though he could no longer grip a sword with his left hand and pain lingered in his shoulder, he began to walk on his own, planning the next steps for his battered cause. Rumors trickled in of Tywin Lannister's forces pushing deeper into the Riverlands, of Roose Bolton mustering troops in the north, claiming some new arrangement with the Iron Throne. The young king in the north was caught between heartbreak and anger, but he was alive, and that meant hope for his bannermen. They rallied around him once more, tattered as they were, forging a grim determination to avenge their fallen. Brienne remained at Catelyn's side, providing her with a quiet pillar of support. Whenever Catelyn's grief threatened to overwhelm her, Brienne would gently remind her that they had survived, that Ned Stark's memory endured in them, and that they had a duty to keep the spirit of House Stark alive. At night, Brienne prowled the camp, ensuring that no assassin could slip in. She slept in small snatches, haunted by dreams of crossbows and Walder Frey's cackling face. Sometimes she would awaken to find her sword in her hand, as though she feared the slaughter would resume at any moment. Despite these nightmares, a flicker of pride sustained her. She had kept her oath. This time she had not failed. Lady Catelyn's life had not been cut short by treachery. The Red Wedding, as the bards would come to call it, had been a horror, but it had not claimed Catelyn or Robb. They had escaped through a stroke of fate and the intervention of a warrior who refused to abandon her vow. The realm would reel from the betrayal, the shockwaves resonating north and south. But for now, at least one bright spark remained alight in the darkness. Amid the shifting tides of war, rumors spread that Walder Frey had lost his chance at a swift victory by failing to kill the king in the north outright. Many still believed Robb dead until travelers spoke of a wounded but living young wolf leading a diminished host. Some whispered that the old gods themselves had intervened. Others spoke in hushed reverence of the tall, golden-haired knight who had wrested the king from the jaws of certain death. The story grew in each retelling, taking on a near-mythic quality among certain small folk eager to see the Freys punished. Meanwhile, at the Twins, Walder Frey fumed, dealing with the fallout of his partial failure. The Lannisters might still reward him for turning on the Starks, but the living son of Ned Stark remained a rallying point for northern resistance. And Edmure Tully, newly married to Rosalind Frey, languished in uncertain captivity, a pawn in Frey's negotiations. Roose Bolton retained the Dreadfort, but with Robb still breathing, he knew his treachery would earn him an enemy as implacable as the North's winter. In the quiet hours of camp, when Robb finally drifted into fevered sleep and the men huddled around campfires, Brienne found Catelyn standing on a small rise overlooking the meandering river. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the water. Catelyn's figure was stiff with sorrow. Brienne approached softly, mindful of the older woman's need for solitude. But Catelyn spoke without turning. "I hate that place," she whispered, voice thick. "The Twins. Whenever I close my eyes, I hear the slaughter. My brother left behind. I see Walder Frey's face." Brienne clasped her hands, not knowing what to say. Finally, Catelyn turned, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You and I both know I might not be here if not for your strength. And Robb, my son might be rotting in that cursed hall." Her lips trembled, but she forced composure. "I can never repay you." Brienne lowered her head. "You owe me nothing, my lady." I swore an oath. "I only wish I could have done more." Catelyn's mouth curved in a sad smile. "If only all knights had your honor." She held Brienne's gaze for a moment, then looked back to the water. "When we reclaim some measure of justice, if we ever do, I'll see that the realm knows what you did. That is a promise." Brienne said nothing, only inclined her head, though deep inside, she felt an unexpected warmth. All her life, she had been mocked for her appearance, her size, her clumsy courtesy. She had lost her reputation at Renly's death, faced scorn from Stannis's men. Now she stood in the hush of night, a living testament that honor and vows still mattered. For the moment, that was enough. In the weeks and months that followed, the remnants of the Stark host navigated a treacherous path through the Riverlands. Skirmishes flared as Frey and Bolton scouts attempted to finish what Walder Frey had started. But the king in the north, wounded, scarred, and fueled by righteous fury, proved an elusive target. Each time the enemy thought they had him cornered, the Starks slipped away, aided by loyal riverlords who despised the Frey's betrayal. The Greyjohn rallied more northern men, forging alliances where he could. Catelyn served as Robb's counsel, her wisdom tempered by bitter experience. And Brienne of Tarth never left their side, offering her sword, her loyalty, and her unbreakable will. On a cold autumn evening, with the leaves turning red and gold, the Northmen finally made contact with Brienne Blackfish Tully, who had evaded capture and led a contingent of stalwart soldiers through hidden paths. Their reunion was muted by the horrors that had befallen Edmure, but the Blackfish provided fresh horses, supplies, and news. He updated them on the devastation wrought by Frey and Lannister forces across the Riverlands. Many lords, furious at Frey's betrayal, were still open to supporting Robb, though fear of Tywin Lannister's reprisal loomed. Yet the presence of a living king in the north, however wounded, reignited embers of rebellion. As word spread, smaller houses quietly rallied. Walder Frey realized his mistake. Every day Robb Stark lived was a day more vengeance might be prepared against him. In the midst of these shifting alliances, Brienne witnessed a new fire kindling in Robb's eyes. His body remained weak and he could no longer fight as he once did. But the steel of his spirit was unbroken, honed now by the edge of grief. "We will have justice," he vowed more than once, staring into the distance as though seeing the banner of the wolf flying once again over the Twins. And Catelyn would stand by him, haunted but determined, forging alliances, penning letters, rallying what support she could. House Bolton, House Frey, those names were spoken with hushed venom, each day fueling the desire for reckoning. One night, under a low-hanging harvest moon, the Blackfish led a small force to raid a Fry outpost that had been harassing local villages. Brienne volunteered to join, seeing it as a chance to strike a blow at those who orchestrated the ambush at the twins. She donned her armor, ignoring the still-healing wound in her side. When she rode out sword in hand, she felt the same grim purpose that had guided her on that fateful night. During the raid, they overcame the Freys with swift brutality, freeing a handful of peasants who had been chained as forced labor. One of the Freys tried to surrender, babbling about having only followed orders. Brienne felt her lip curl in disgust. "Your orders were to murder unarmed men," she spat. She did not kill him outright, nor did she stay to watch the Blackfish's men handle the prisoners. Her vengeance was not personal satisfaction in slaying the helpless, but in ensuring that the cause she fought for, Catelyn's cause, Robb's cause, prevailed. She walked away with a strange heaviness in her chest, the ghost of the slaughter still echoing in her memories. Time passed, bringing starker weather and deeper shadows across the land. The Northmen, still struggling to rebuild their strength, learned to rely on stealth and cunning rather than open warfare. Robb's band might never field an army to rival Tywin's or even Walder Frey's in a direct siege, but they remained a thorn in the side of their enemies. Messages went to the Eyrie, to the Vale, pleading for aid from Catelyn's sister, Lysa, though no reply came. The war had devolved into fragmented skirmishes and a bitter stalemate. Still, the hope of reversing the Red Wedding's injustice flickered like a candle in a hurricane. Through all of this, Brienne stood watch each night. She rarely allowed herself more than a few hours of sleep, ever alert for assassins or scouts. She observed the effect of war on her companions. Men who once sang songs around campfires now stared hollow-eyed at the dark, flinching at every sound. She saw Catelyn grow more solemn by the day, though a spark of maternal love still lit her eyes whenever she spoke to Robb. The young wolf himself bore his pain stoically, leaning on his mother and the great Jon for counsel. Brienne had never imagined she would become so entwined with the Stark family, but she took her oaths seriously, and now it felt personal. She carried a quiet wish to see Walder Frey answer for his crimes, to see House Bolton's treachery exposed. No matter the cost. One bleak morning, as the cold wind rattled the brittle leaves, Catelyn found Brienne standing alone near the edge of their makeshift camp. The trees were sparse, revealing a gray sky. Brienne had a whetstone in hand, carefully honing the edge of her sword. The repetitive rasp of stone against steel was almost soothing. She looked up to see Catelyn approach, eyes tired. "My lady," Brienne said softly. "You should be resting." Catelyn shook her head. "I can't. My mind won't let me sleep." She paused, then asked quietly, "Do you think we can ever truly undo what happened at the twins? So many died. It haunts me." Brienne studied Catelyn's face, noting the deep lines of worry etched there. "Nothing will bring the dead back," she answered, voice tinged with sorrow. "But as long as you and your son live, there's a chance to stand against those who perpetrated that treachery. Perhaps in that we can find a measure of, if not peace, then at least justice." Catelyn nodded, tears threatening. "Justice," she echoed. "We will have it, by the old gods and the new. I swear it. As for you, Brienne, I once thought you would leave once your vow was fulfilled. But you remain. You've had opportunities to part ways, yet you stay." Brienne's large hands tightened on the sword's hilt. She exhaled a slow breath. "My vow isn't done. You are still in danger. Your son is still in danger. I will not abandon you. I gave my word." In truth, she also felt a connection she could scarcely explain. Lady Catelyn treated her with respect, affection even. A mother's warmth, something Brienne had never truly known outside her own family, who had tried to mold her into a proper lady. And she saw in Robb Stark a glimmer of Renly's dream of a just king. She would not forsake them now. Catelyn's expression softened. "Then I am grateful. You have become more than a sworn sword to me. You have become a friend." The words stirred an emotion in Brienne that she rarely allowed herself, a mixture of gratitude, humility, and longing for acceptance. She bent her head, saying nothing. The lady placed a gentle hand on the knight's armored forearm. "In time," Catelyn went on, "I pray we can reclaim the North, or at least ensure my son's safety. When that day comes, you will always have a place at our hearth." Brienne nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you, my lady." She glanced at the horizon as though searching for a dawn that was still far off. "Until then, I stand guard." She resumed honing her blade, the rasping sound echoing in the chilly air. And so they continued, forging new alliances, evading traps, nursing Robb back to health. The Red Wedding would forever scar them, but it did not break them entirely. Where in another thread of fate, Catelyn and Robb had perished in that bloody hall, here they survived, thanks to a tall warrior who refused to set aside her vow. The war was far from over, its outcome uncertain, yet a single spark of hope still shone. From that spark, the North might rise again, hungry for vengeance, determined to cast down the Freys, to humble the Boltons, and to face the Lannisters on more equal terms. Brienne of Tarth would remain at Catelyn Stark's side, sword unsheathed against the encroaching darkness. And together they carried forward the memory of all they had lost, fueled by the promise that as long as they lived, the wolves of Winterfell would not be so easily silenced. Brienne of Tarth stood beneath a sky the color of hammered iron, the encroaching dusk painting the drifting clouds in hues of ashen purple. Wind rustled through the sparse thicket around the small encampment, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. Nearby, the waters of the Trident ran dark with twilight. Overhead, crows darted back and forth, their cawing cries echoing across the riverlands. The weight of the past weeks pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden. Each breath felt torn from her lungs, yet she forced herself to remain vigilant, one hand resting on the pommel of her sword. A few tents, tattered and muddied, clustered amid the trees. Within them lay the battered remnants of the northern host that had once marched proudly beneath King Robb Stark's banner. Now, all that kept them moving was a desperate will to survive and a smoldering hunger for justice. She had not imagined her life could change so swiftly. Yet one choice, her decision to remain by Catelyn Stark's side at the twins, had snatched them from the maw of the Red Wedding, at least partially. The massacre still devoured her thoughts. Crossbows firing into revelers, the floor awash with blood, Walder Frey's cruel laughter echoing off stone walls. Brienne could not purge the images from her mind, but they had lived. Catelyn had lived, as had Robb, though the young king's wounds were grievous. That alone was reason enough for Brienne to press on. She would not fail this vow. Not this time. Inside the largest tent, dimly lit by flickering lanterns, Catelyn Stark hovered over her son. Robb lay atop a makeshift pallet, pillows beneath his bandaged shoulder. His face, usually so confident despite his youth, was pale and slick with sweat. At the moment, he was caught between fevered sleep and fragile wakefulness, his eyes half-lidded. The wound that Roose Bolton had carved across his shoulder had nearly crippled him, to say nothing of the bolt grazes and bruises from that night. Maester Catelyn, an older man with wispy white hair, leaned over Robb with vials of tinctures and poultices. The hush in the tent was thick as Catelyn tested the bandages, replaced them, then forced a foul-smelling dose of milk of the poppy past Robb's cracked lips. Catelyn knelt by Robb's side, her hand smoothing his damp hair. "Shoo, my sweet boy," she whispered. "Rest. Don't strain yourself." She looked older than her years, the lines of worry etched into her brow. Her grief lingered like a living creature crouching in her posture. She had not slept more than a few hours a night since the escape from the twins. Between the sorrow of losing so many loyal men and the continued dread that Walder Frey or Bolton riders might descend upon them at any moment, Catelyn's face had taken on a pinched, wan cast. Yet, each time she gazed upon her son's face, there was an unmistakable maternal devotion in her eyes that kept her going, breath by breath. Outside the tent, the great John Umber, paced like a caged animal. The big man's disheveled beard and wild hair, streaked with dried blood from skirmishes, only enhanced the impression of raw ferocity. He could not stand still for more than a few breaths. His frustration thrummed through every muscle, as though he longed for a target on which to unleash his rage. When Brienne approached, he looked up, teeth bared in a near snarl. "We cannot linger," he growled, gesturing in the direction of the distant road. "Some scouts returned a while ago, spotted Frey outriders a league south. They're on our scent." Brienne's eyes narrowed. "How many? A dozen, maybe more. Hard to say for certain." The great John looked beyond her shoulder, his gaze flicking toward the tent where Robb lay. "If they chase us, we can't outrun them forever. Not with the king wounded. Not with half our men limping on battered legs." Brienne's grip tightened on her sword pommel. "Then we either fight or find a new place to hide. We can't let them catch us on open ground." A muscle in the great John's jaw twitched. He nodded. "We could stand and face them. A single war party we can handle. But if more come behind, we'd be cornered." Brienne knew the truth of it. Even in the best scenario, if they defeated one party of Freys, the noise would carry, and Walder Frey would send a larger host. Roose Bolton too might dispatch men. The trap might tighten once again. "We need to move, then," she said, voice low. "Find someplace defensible." "My thought exactly," rumbled the Great John. "Some of our scouts claim there's an old watchtower near the Blue Fork. Rotten in parts, but still has walls. We could hole up there if we had to." Brienne's mind spun with possibilities. They had little choice but to keep Robb concealed and safe until he healed enough to travel longer distances. "We must do it carefully. The roads are dangerous." She took a deep breath. "Have the men break camp. I'll tell Lady Catelyn." The Great John dipped his head, striding away to muster what remained of their fighting force, which was not much. Maybe a couple hundred men, half of them wounded, the rest battered from the betrayal. Their once proud banners were stained with dried blood and the dust of constant flight. But they had no illusions left. All that remained was survival, and the hope that the tide might someday turn. Brienne slipped quietly into the tent. Catelyn was still at Robb's side, though the king's eyes were closed. Maester Collins straightened upon seeing her, pressing a finger to his lips. "He's resting now," the maester murmured. "The fever has subsided a bit, but he needs quiet." Catelyn brushed a damp lock of hair off Robb's forehead, then rose and stepped outside with Brienne. Her eyes searched the knight's face. "Is something amiss?" she asked, voice tight with concern. Brienne explained what the Great John had discovered, the presence of Frey outriders. Catelyn's features paled, her mouth setting into a grim line. "We knew it was only a matter of time. I'll not let them catch us sleeping." "They won't," Brienne assured her. "But we must leave within the hour." Catelyn glanced back at the tent flap, behind which Robb lay. "Travel will be hard on him. The fever is still in his bones." "I know, my lady, but if we stay, they'll kill him. We must get him on a litter and slip away before the frays converge. The Great John said there's a watchtower near the Blue Fork, and we can fortify it for a short while." Catelyn's shoulders sagged. "Then that is what we'll do." She paused, eyes brimming with anguish and tired resolve. "Help me ready him. We'll move slowly, but we'll move." Together, they returned inside. Robb stirred at the hushed commotion, blinking up at them. Even in his weakened state, the set of his jaw carried the weight of command. "We're moving," he rasped. Catelyn nodded, forcing a steadiness she did not fully feel. "Yes, my love. The frays are near." Robb closed his eyes briefly, a flicker of regret crossing his face. "I should be out there, leading, not lying here like a child." Brienne knelt beside him. "You're no child, your grace. You're wounded and we cannot lose you." She helped him adjust so he could sit up. Pain flickered across his features, but he pressed his lips together and bore it. Catelyn slipped an arm around his back to support him. Maester Catelyn quickly prepared some herbs to ease the pain and quell any returning fever. Then, at Brienne and Catelyn's command, several soldiers entered to gently lift Robb and carry him out to a waiting litter rigged from spears and torn canvas. Robb grimaced but said nothing, swallowing his pride for necessity's sake. Outside, the northern men were already assembling in grim silence. Horses stomped in the damp earth, the sound echoing in the hush of twilight. A handful of battered banners still snapped in the wind, House Stark's dire wolf, dirted but unbroken, and House Umber's roaring giant. The Great John barked orders, guiding the men to form a protective ring around the litter. Brienne kept near Catelyn, scanning the edge of the campsite. The lingering memory of crossbow bolts whistling past her ear at the twins made her stomach clench in constant anticipation of an attack. They left no trace behind, scattering their campfires to avoid giving watchers a precise location. The columns of men and horses drifted quietly through the trees, like ghosts on a darkened battlefield. Brienne caught sight of the Blackfish, Brinden Tully, riding at the forefront. His expression was as unreadable as stone. He had joined them not long after the escape, bringing with him a small band of loyal riverlords. In the swirl of upheaval, the Blackfish had refused to submit to Walder Frey's demands to surrender Riverrun, though rumors said the castle had eventually fallen to a siege from the Freys and the might of the Lannisters. Edmure Tully's fate remained uncertain. That knowledge gnawed at Catelyn's heart daily, Brienne knew. They traveled well into the night, stopping only when the men needed to rest the litter-bearers. Robb drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling about battles or gray wind, at other times gazing blearily at his mother as if to reassure himself she was still there. Each pause in the march brought the same question: were the Freys behind them, moving closer? The Great John sent outriders to scout, but each returned with incomplete sightings, shadows, the faint glow of torches in distant fields. Nothing conclusive. Still, the tension never abated. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke over the rolling hills, the old watchtower lay within reach. Overgrown brambles and thistles flanked a half-collapsed stone structure perched on a slight rise. A crumbling wall encircled it, though large sections had tumbled into ruin. Once, in an earlier age, it might have served as a warning beacon for the river lords, but now it stood neglected, the top partially caved in. Yet it was better than open ground. The Great John wasted no time ordering men to clear the area, gather stones to shore up the gaps, and post sentries along the perimeter. Brienne waded into the thick of this work, hauling broken timbers to block off vulnerable breaches. Catelyn supervised the construction of a sheltered spot inside the tower's base where Robb could be placed under a makeshift roof. The morning was spent in a flurry of repairs and watchful glances at the horizon. By midday, the men had done what they could. A ragged sense of accomplishment lingered beneath the tension. They had at least a partial wall to protect them, angles from which to set pikes and aim bows. Brienne felt a momentary flicker of relief as she stood on a pile of rubble that overlooked the road. The ground rose and fell in gentle slopes, offering enough of a vantage to see approaching riders from a distance. If the Freys came, they would not catch the Starks unawares this time. She jumped down from the rubble, ignoring the protest of bruised muscles in her legs. The crash of the Red Wedding had nearly broken her body, but she'd forced her wounds to heal as best they could on the march. Now was not the time to nurse pain. Everywhere she looked, men huddled around small fires, draining their last skins of water, or else dozing with weapons at their sides. Maester Catelyn tended to those with fevers or infected gashes. A hush settled, the hush of exhausted men who knew the next fight might come at any moment. Brienne made her way to the tower's interior, where Robb's litter was placed amid old stones. Catelyn knelt beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. The king's eyes were open, though heavy-lidded. A single arrow of sunlight from a high crack illuminated motes of dust swirling around them. "My lady," Brienne said quietly, announcing her presence. "We've done what we can to fortify the walls. If the Freys arrive, we'll be ready." Catelyn turned, a weary half-smile flickering on her lips. "Thank you." She looked as though she had not slept in an age. "And the men? They're at their posts or resting?" "The Great John said he'll watch from the top of the ruin for a while. The Blackfish is out scouting with a few riders." Brienne paused, glancing at Robb's face. "How is he?" Olive, Robb rasped, though his voice was raw. He tried to shift, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "Feels as though a horse trampled my arm." Catelyn ran her fingers through her son's auburn hair. "Drink more of Maester Catelyn's tea. It helps the pain." Robb scowled. "It numbs my mind, too. I need to think, plan." He turned to Brienne, forcing composure. "You said the Blackfish is scouting. Good. We must be certain of how many Freys lurk." "Yes, your grace," Brienne replied. Even now, in his weakened state, he tried to rule as a king should. She admired his determination, though she worried he might push himself too hard. He coughed, stifling a groan. "If they come for us, we'll fight." Catelyn interjected, her voice quiet but firm. "We are in no condition for open battle, Robb." "Not yet." "So what do you propose?" he asked, a hint of impatience creeping in. Catelyn hesitated, meeting Brienne's eyes for a fleeting moment. Then she spoke with carefully measured calm. "We can hold this place against a small party, that much is certain. But if Walder Frey sends a larger force, or if Bolton's men come down from the north, no half-collapsed tower will save us. We need a place where we can regroup and gather allies. Or we need to slip away entirely, hide ourselves until you've recovered." Robb's jaw tightened. "Hide? I am king in the north. I should be leading men, not hiding." Catelyn's eyes flickered with sorrow. "You'll lead them again. But you must live to do so. Right now, the Freys and Boltons have the advantage. They think you too weak to rally. They expect you to die in a ditch or else make some desperate stand. Perhaps we can use their assumptions to our gain." Brienne observed Robb's expression. In the meager light, she could see how pale he truly was, how the bandages around his shoulder had fresh red stains. Even breathing seemed an effort. Yet his will was unbroken. "So you suggest we vanish for a while?" Robb said. "Let them think us scattered? It may be the best chance to draw them out or find new supporters," Catelyn said. "The Great John can lead raids on Frey outposts, gather supplies, harass them while you bide your strength elsewhere. By the time they realize you yet live and command loyal men, it may be too late for them to muster a decisive blow." Robb closed his eyes momentarily, exhaling a ragged breath. I hate the idea of skulking about the countryside like outlaws. Brienne spoke softly. Outlaws can still fight for justice. You remain the rightful king in the north. Your men follow you out of loyalty and love. They'll not think less of you for healing from a wound inflicted by treachery. He opened his eyes, gaze flicking to her, then to his mother. Perhaps you're both right. I suppose I have little choice. The question is, where do we go? Before Catelyn could answer, an echo of hooves against rocky ground drew their attention. Brienne went to the tower's entrance, hand on her sword, and saw the Blackfish riding in with half a dozen men. She beckoned him inside. He dismounted quickly, dust caking the hem of his cloak. "We found Frey outriders," he announced without preamble, directing his words to Catelyn and Robb. "A band of 20 or so men not far south. They're probing the area, likely searching for us. They had a banner, the Twin Towers. No large host yet, but that could be the vanguard." Catelyn nodded grimly. "Then we have little time. We can hold them off if they attack, but if they send word back and more come..." The Blackfish's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We might do better to lure them into an ambush, kill or capture them before they can report. Cut out Frey's eyes, so to speak." Robb shifted on the litter, biting back a groan. "That might work. If they never return, Walder might suspect something, but he won't know our location or our numbers." "I like it." The Blackfish inclined his head. "I can take a few men who are skilled in stealth. We'll intercept the outriders, finish them quickly, and be back by nightfall." Catelyn hesitated. "Brienne, be careful. If they send a scout for reinforcements..." He lifted a placating hand. "We'll have watchers posted. If more than a score approach, we'll vanish. I'm no stranger to infiltration." He turned to Robb. "With your leave, your grace." Robb forced a nod, his good hand pressing against the bandage at his ribs. "Go, uncle. Make sure they learn nothing. And tell the Great John to keep our defenses at the ready." The Blackfish saluted in a curt, soldierly way, then departed. Hoofbeats trailed off into the distance as he and his men left. Catelyn exhaled a shaky breath, pressing a hand over her eyes. The Riverlands are infested with Frey men. This is going to be a long war. Brienne bowed her head. "We're ready for it." She meant the words, though an undercurrent of dread tightened her gut. How many more men would die before Walder Frey paid for his treachery? And what of Roose Bolton, who had delivered that perfidious final blow in the hall? Brienne had seen the expression on Bolton's face, calm and cold as he tried to cut Robb down. How many allies might he have in the north itself? Every road seemed fraught with peril. The day stretched on, tense and watchful. Men scanned the horizon from atop the broken walls. Robb dozed fitfully. Catelyn rarely left his side, though she ventured out once to speak with the Great John, confirming fallback plans if the outriders stumbled upon them. Brienne helped the men gather whatever meager supplies the watchtower still contained. Mostly rotted timber, a few ancient iron tools, even a coil of rope that might be used for repairs. The air grew colder as dusk approached, and a biting wind whistled through the cracks in the stone. Soldiers lit small fires inside sheltered corners. Smoke curled toward the open sky, and at times Brienne worried the glow might betray them. But they needed warmth, and so they took the risk, banking each fire so it would not blaze too high. At last, near moonrise, the Blackfish returned. His men rode in quietly, leading 3 extra horses that bore the limp bodies of dead Frey riders. Brienne and a handful of soldiers rushed forward. "Success?" she asked under her breath. The Blackfish dismounted, nodding. "We caught them in a ravine, took them by surprise. They're all dead save one who escaped. We couldn't run him down before he vanished into the woods. That means Walder Frey will know something happened. We must assume he'll send more men this way soon." Catelyn emerged from the tower, the wind snatching at her auburn hair. She regarded the lifeless Frey riders with undisguised revulsion, then looked to the Blackfish. "When?" "Hard to say," he replied, wiping blood from a cut on his chin. "A few days, maybe less, if the escaped man finds a larger patrol quickly. But we can be sure they'll be coming, likely in numbers we can't hope to face here. Brienne felt the tension coil in her chest. Then we depart, she said quietly. Tonight, if we can. That was always the plan, Catelyn murmured. We can't be trapped here. We'll load the wounded onto horses and litters again. And we'll do as we discussed, split our forces. Some with the Great John to harass Fry lines, sow confusion, while I take Robb to a safer haven. The Great John, overhearing, approached with a determined set to his jaw. He said, my men are ready. We'll make enough noise behind us that the Freys and Boltons will think the king in the north rides at our head. Meanwhile, you and his grace slip away quietly. Catelyn's voice caught. That means we'll have fewer guards for Robb. That's why I'll go with you, Brienne said, surprising even herself with how swift and certain the words came. She bowed her head in respect. If you'll have me, my lady, my vow is to protect you both. Catelyn reached out and briefly gripped Brienne's armored forearm. I'd not have it any other way. And I, the Blackfish added, will ride with you as well. Catelyn blinked, momentarily torn. Uncle, are you certain? The Great John might need you. My men can follow his command for a time. My place is with you, especially if we seek to free Edmure eventually. There's also Riverrun to consider. If we can gather enough loyal houses discreetly, we may yet strike back. A plan began to take shape among them, one that promised risk at every turn. The Great John would lead a contingent that carried the Stark banners openly, making it seem as though Robb Stark traveled with them. They would ride north and east, striking at small Fry strongholds, burning supply lines, luring pursuers. Meanwhile, under cover of darkness, Catelyn and Robb, along with a small escort that included Brienne and the Blackfish, would head in a more westerly direction, aiming to find a secure refuge away from the heaviest fighting. Their path might eventually curve south of the Red Fork, then circle back toward the Riverlands once Robb's health improved. Every piece of the plan balanced on a knife's edge. If the Freys realized their trick, the group with Robb could be cornered easily, for they numbered too few to mount a large defense. Still, it offered a chance to keep Robb alive, and that was worth any risk. Preparations were swift. Men carried out saddles and gear in near silence, mindful that it was best not to draw attention. The Greyjohn's forces formed ranks near the watchtower's crumbled gate, their horses stamping in the cold night. Banners were refastened to poles so that any watchers from afar would see the direwolf standard. Meanwhile, inside the tower, Catelyn woke Robb gently. He was groggy, the lines of pain etched on his brow. She whispered the plan, stroking his hair as she spoke. He nodded in weary resignation. The small escort mustered near the western side of the wall. Brienne readied 2 horses, ensuring they were the sturdiest they could spare. One was a plain brown gelding, calm enough for a wounded man to ride if supported. The other was a mare for Catelyn. Brienne would follow on foot at times if it eased Robb's journey, whatever was necessary to protect them. The Blackfish, silent and watchful, inspected the terrain leading away from the tower. Before they parted ways, the Great John approached Robb's litter. Robb tried to sit up straight, though pain shadowed his eyes. The Great John bent his knee, clasping Robb's good hand in both of his. "Your Grace," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep them busy, and when next we meet, we'll make the Freys weep for their treachery." Robb squeezed his hand weakly. "I know you will." He swallowed hard. "Thank you, Great John. You've always been true to House Stark." The big man bowed his head, then turned to Catelyn. "My lady, keep him safe. Keep yourself safe. The North needs you both." His gaze flicked to Brienne, a flicker of respect in his rugged features. "And you, Lady Brienne, thank you for saving the king. May the gods watch over you all." Brienne inclined her head in silence, feeling the magnitude of the Greyjohn's loyalty. He would lead men to fight possibly hopeless battles, all to buy them time. She prayed it would not be in vain. Then, with a final nod, the Great John mounted his horse, signaled his men, and led them eastward. Their torches flickered in the dark, forming a bright column that quickly disappeared behind the rolling hills. Soon, Brienne could hear only the distant pounding of hooves fading until silence wrapped around the old watchtower once more. In that hush, Catelyn and the Blackfish oversaw the gentle transfer of Robb from the litter onto the back of the calm brown gelding. Maester Catelyn hovered anxiously, stuffing pouches of herbs and salves into a saddlebag. The old man had chosen to accompany Robb as well, knowing his skill might be needed. Careful, he murmured to the men who lifted Robb's weakened body. Robb clenched his jaw to stifle a groan, sweat beading on his temple. Brienne checked the girth straps, ensuring Robb would be secure. She then mounted her own horse, a rangy dapple gray courser. Catelyn swung into the saddle of the mare, a determined set to her face. Around them, only a handful of soldiers remained, perhaps a score in all, those sworn to House Stark or House Tully, willing to keep the king alive at all costs. The Blackfish led them forward, and in the cover of night, they slipped away from the watchtower. The riverlands were a patchwork of farmland, streams, and rolling hills crisscrossed with muddy roads. With no time for well-traveled routes, they cut through lesser paths, sometimes forging across shallow creeks or trudging through thick brush. Every so often, a soldier would dismount to clear a snag or dislodge a fallen log that blocked their way. Robb did his best to remain conscious, though the jostling was pure agony. When it became too much, Maester Catelyn administered small doses of milk of the poppy. Catelyn rode close, one hand occasionally resting on Robb's leg in reassurance. Brienne stayed near them, scanning the darkness for any sign of torches or prowling riders. They traveled through the night, pace slowed by the need to spare Robb further agony. By dawn, a pale sun rose behind a thick bank of clouds. The small column halted near a copse of willows, the ground marshy beneath the horses' hooves. The men were exhausted, eyes bleary. Brienne herself felt the ache in every muscle, the lingering pangs of unhealed bruises. But any rest carried risk. They found a relatively dry patch under the willows where they could dismount and catch their breath. Robb, nearly delirious from pain and lack of sleep, had to be helped off his horse. The Blackfish and Brienne eased him onto a spread of blankets while Catelyn knelt with him. "It's all right," she murmured, voice trembling. "We'll rest a moment." His breath came in ragged gasps. "Mother," he whispered. "I'm sorry." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "You've nothing to apologize for." "Hush." Brienne withdrew a few steps to give them privacy, though her heart twisted at the sight. He was so young still, forced into a war that only grew bloodier by the day. She whispered a silent prayer to any gods that would listen. Let him survive, let Catelyn find some measure of peace. Then she glanced at the horizon, remembering their half-formed plan. They aimed to cross the Red Fork, eventually heading west toward territory less patrolled by Freys. But that might take days of careful travel, possibly longer, given Robb's condition. As the men tended the horses, Brienne conferred quietly with the Blackfish. "We have no idea if the Greyjoy's ruse will succeed," she said. "The Freys might suspect the trick." The Blackfish nodded, his weathered features grim. "Aye, they might. But it's the best chance we have to keep Walder Frey from focusing all his efforts here. If he believes the king in the north rides with a larger column, he'll chase that shadow and give us time." "Time for what?" Brienne asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. The Blackfish's gaze drifted toward Robb, who lay trembling under Catelyn's care. "For him to mend," he said softly, "and for us to find new allies. The Riverlands are not entirely lost. Many lords despise Walder Frey. He rules by fear, and fear can be turned. With enough cunning, we might gather them quietly. Then, in time, when Robb can stand and lead again, we strike." Brienne nodded. The idea aligned with what Catelyn had suggested. Yet so many obstacles remained: Tywin Lannister's formidable armies, the betrayal of the Boltons, the uncertain fates of other northern houses. "We'll do what we must," she said at last. "He's still their king, wounded or not." "Yes," the Blackfish murmured, "I sad but resolute." "He is." They rested only a short while, for the risk of detection was ever present. Catelyn forced Robb to drink more water, helped him swallow some stewed herbs that Maester Catelyn concocted over a tiny fire. Then, with excruciating gentleness, they got him back onto his horse. The procession continued westward, threading through half-abandoned farmland. At times, they passed glimpses of deserted hovels or charred cottages. The war had ravaged these lands, leaving the small folk scattered. Each time they encountered a frightened family, Catelyn would reassure them the king in the north meant no harm, but the peasants often shrank away, terrified of both Lannisters and Starks alike. Brienne saw the pain in Catelyn's eyes, pain that came from realizing how the realm suffered while lords and kings fought their wars. Twice that day, they spotted distant columns of smoke that might have signaled a Frey patrol or a burning village. Each time, they diverted, forging new paths until the smoke was only a faint smudge behind them. The horses grew more fatigued, but the group pressed on, halting only when night fell once more. This time, they camped in the ruins of an old sept, its walls partially collapsed. Broken statues of the seven lay scattered in the high grass. Catelyn, devout to the gods in her quiet way, took a moment to kneel before one battered statue that might once have been the mother, though the features were eroded by weather. Brienne stood watch beside her, the two women lit by moonlight drifting through the broken roof. For a fleeting instant, Brienne thought she saw tears shining on Catelyn's cheeks, but the older woman bowed her head, letting her hair hide her face. When they rose the next morning, Robb's fever had abated somewhat, though he remained weak. By midday, they came upon a small roadside inn near a crossing of two little-used tracks. The inn looked half derelict, with shuttered windows and an empty yard. Cautiously, the Blackfish and a few men approached. They found only an old couple who owned the place, living in fear of roving soldiers. The man and woman nearly bolted until they spotted Catelyn's gentle approach and heard her words of reassurance. She promised silver in exchange for a roof and a place to rest for a night, somewhere to keep their wounded king out of the elements. The old couple, clearly desperate for coin, agreed. They let the small band stable their horses in a rickety barn and bed down inside the inn's main room. It was not large, but it was intact. One fireplace still worked, and with the doors barred, it offered more comfort than they'd had in weeks. There, on the warped wooden floor, Robb was finally able to lie down on a pallet by the fire. Catelyn and the maester hovered over him, cleaning his wounds, reapplying salves. Brienne organized the men to keep watch in shifts, ensuring no one could approach unseen. That evening, as the wind howled outside, Catelyn approached Brienne where she stood by a shuttered window, peering through a crack into the dark. The flickering lamplight caught the silver tones in Catelyn's hair. "He's resting more peacefully now," she said, voice hushed in the quiet of the inn. "He's had some broth, kept it down." Brienne nodded, relieved. "He needs that strength. And you, my lady, you need rest as well." Catelyn offered a faint smile. "I'll tea when I can. Too many thoughts plague me. Edmure trapped at the twins or worse. My father's house in shambles. My daughters, for all I know, they're still captives in King's Landing. And the boy, my Bran, my Rickon," her voice wavered. "I only have rumors of their fates. Some say Theon Greyjoy killed them in Winterfell, but no one is certain." Brienne remembered hearing bits of those tales. Her heart ached for Catelyn. "Rumors can be wrong," she offered gently. "We must hold to hope until we know otherwise." Catelyn's lips thinned. "Hope?" she repeated as though tasting the word. She glanced toward the fireplace, where Robb lay curled under blankets. "He still wants vengeance for what happened at the twins. Perhaps in time we can gather enough forces. But so many have fled or turned cloak. Walder Frey has the Lannisters' blessing and Bolton. The idea that a northern lord betrayed him so thoroughly, it breaks my heart." Brienne lowered her gaze. She had no soothing words. All she could do was vow silently to keep these two alive, no matter the cost. They remained at that inn for 2 nights, giving Robb's body a chance to mend further and allowing the horses to rest. The old couple accepted their coin, though they eyed the assembled soldiers warily. On the morning of their departure, the Blackfish approached Brienne with quiet urgency. "My scouts have seen signs of more riders on the main roads west. Merchants, maybe, or soldiers in disguise. We must keep to hidden paths." Brienne agreed. "And if we can, perhaps we should cross the Red Fork soon. We'll find fewer Frey patrols once we're deeper into western lands." Catelyn concurred. With that, they saddled up again, helped Robb onto his horse, and continued their slow journey. Each day was a study in caution. Traveling side lanes, cutting through meadows to avoid distant columns of dust, concealing themselves in stands of trees at the first sign of movement on the horizon. Twice, they narrowly evaded confrontation, once hiding in a thick cluster of reeds by a riverbank while a small party of armed riders passed. The men wore no overt sigil, but the black crossbows they carried suggested either mercenaries or Frey hirelings. The world seemed filled with enemies. Nonetheless, with each passing league, Robb grew a fraction stronger. able to ride with less assistance, talk more without lapsing into exhausted silence. One evening, as they made camp near a shallow ravine, he summoned Brienne to his small fire. Catelyn was dozing for once, her head pillowed on folded cloaks, so it was only Robb, the maester, and a few guards stirring about. Robb's pale face was illuminated by the orange glow, the shadows dancing on the bandage peeking from his shirt collar. "Brienne," he said, gesturing for her to sit on a nearby stump. He wore a cloak around his shoulders for warmth, though his left arm remained in a sling. "I never had the chance to speak at length since that night at the Twins. You saved my mother, and you saved me. I owe you my life." She inclined her head, her voice quiet. "I simply did what honor demanded, Your Grace." He managed a thin smile. Not all knights would do so. Most men would have seized any chance to flee once they saw the slaughter, or might have tried only to protect themselves. My mother told me it was your intervention that turned the tide, that gave her time to reach me. Without you, I'd be dead on that floor. Brienne shifted, uncomfortable with praise. Your mother is my lady. I swore an oath to keep her safe, to keep her family safe, as best I could. I only wish I could have saved more. He nodded solemnly. Yes, we lost too many good men, but for now I'm just grateful to be alive, even if I feel half a man with this wound. He gestured gingerly to his shoulder. My sword arm is weak, my body racked by fevers. Yet I must lead, or the North will be lost. She studied his features. Beneath the weariness, she saw in him a glimmer of Ned Stark's quiet strength, something resolute. You will recover, Your Grace. Your body needs time. The North is patient, it endures, and your mother and uncle guide you well. He sighed, the firelight flickering in his eyes. I've no illusions about the road ahead. Walder Frey and Roose Bolton have shattered my forces. Tywin Lannister sits in King's Landing, ever poised to crush rebellions. And I betrayed the Freys once before, so they'll never forgive me. Still, I will not yield. My father taught me to face adversity with honor. A pause, then he added, Honor, though, has become a precarious thing in these times. Brienne let out a soft breath. I understand, but so long as men like you fight for it, honor won't vanish entirely. He regarded her with something akin to respect. I hope you're right. They shared a brief silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Robb cleared his throat. Thank you, he repeated quietly. When I'm strong again, we'll repay the Freys in kind. Until then, keep my mother safe and keep me from making foolish decisions if you can. I'll rely on your counsel as well. She rose, bowing her head. I'm no counselor, Your Grace, but I'll speak truth when asked. That is all I want, Robb said. He leaned back, wincing at a stab of pain. Now get some rest if you can. We'll need fresh eyes tomorrow. Brienne complied, stepping away into the night. She bedded down not far from Catelyn's side, sword within arm's reach. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, she dreamed of the twins once more. She saw crossbow bolts whistling overhead, men's faces contorted in betrayal, the old Lord Walder cackling. She even glimpsed the specter of Roose Bolton's pale eyes. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, gaze sweeping the dark to assure herself it was only a dream. But the recollection left her trembling with anger. No, she would not let the Freys or the Boltons tear down the last vestiges of House Stark. Not while she could still draw breath. In the weeks that followed, they continued their slow, careful migration west. Robb's condition improved steadily, though not without setbacks, occasional fevers, or bouts of pain that required rest. Catelyn's relief at his survival was always tempered by the knowledge that they moved through lands rife with potential enemies. More than once, they narrowly avoided travelers or small bands of soldiers. The Blackfish proved invaluable, leading scouting missions that either misdirected or delayed those who might threaten them. Their party never grew large enough to stand in open battle, but they also managed to avoid slaughter. As the leaves turned from green to gold, they finally crossed the Red Fork at a shallow ford using the cover of twilight. The crossing was dangerous. The current was faster than expected, soaking horses up to their flanks. Men cursed and shivered, Robb gritted his teeth, and at one point Catelyn nearly slid from her saddle when her horse stumbled on a slick rock. But Brienne was at her side instantly, steadying her until they reached firm ground. By the time they emerged onto the western bank, they were all drenched and cold but safe. That night, they built fires in a secluded hollow to dry their clothes and bedrolls. Robb insisted on helping gather wood, though he ended up nearly collapsing from the effort. Catelyn scolded him gently, reminding him to pace himself. The king only laughed, a low and tired sound, but laughter nonetheless. That small spark of humor was a bomb, a reminder they still lived. Once the fires were blazing, the men huddled together to share what meager rations remained. Catelyn, the Blackfish, Robb, and Brienne sat around a single fire, conferring in hushed tones. The conversation turned to potential allies in the western Riverlands. A few minor lords disliked the phrase and might secretly aid them with supplies. Others, though, had bent the knee to the Lannisters out of sheer survival. We might try to reach House Mallister, the Blackfish suggested. They were always stalwart in their loyalty to Riverrun, though I've heard rumors the Mallisters have been forced to accept harsh terms from the Iron Throne. Catelyn sighed. They'll have reason to be cautious. Any open support for us might invite retribution. And we can't even promise them that we have a large force. Our host is so small, scattered. The Greyjoy's men could be a world away by now. Robb rubbed at his forehead, frustration etched in every line. We need to know if any of our men still hold Moat Cailin in the north, or if the Greyjoys took it. We need to know the Bolton's situation, or if any of the northern lords remain loyal. We need so much information, and we have so little. Brienne stared at the flames, thinking of ways to gather intelligence. We could send riders in different directions. Or perhaps we can dispatch a few men in secret to see if your mother's sister, Lisa, in the Vale might offer some assistance. The Vale remains largely untouched by the war. Catelyn's lips thinned. My sister has grown reclusive. She refused to aid us when Ned was taken, and she's refused all previous requests. Yet perhaps with the news of the Red Wedding, if she learns I'm alive and in need, she might change her stance. She did not sound hopeful. The Blackfish made a low sound of disapproval. Lisa is not known for her courage. But we can try. In the end, they agreed on a plan. The Blackfish would lead a small foray to House Mallister's territory to gauge whether the Mallisters or neighboring lords might at least offer food or shelter. Meanwhile, Brienne would remain with Robb and Catelyn, searching for a safe haven deep in the hills. If they could secure that, perhaps they could establish a hidden seed of operations, sending out couriers and forging alliances more confidently. So it was that, a few days later, the Blackfish departed under cover of an early morning mist with half a dozen riders. They left the rest behind, including Maester Colin and enough guards to protect Robb. Brienne felt a pang watching him go, for the Blackfish had been a stalwart presence. But this mission was necessary. The group parted with quiet words of encouragement, no fanfare. The roads were too dangerous for sentimental farewells. When the sun rose higher, Brienne helped load their sparse belongings. Robb insisted on mounting his horse himself. Though he grunted in pain, he managed, a testament to how far his recovery had come. Catelyn eyed him with a mixture of pride and worry. Don't push too hard, she chided softly, adjusting his cloak. He offered a wry smile. What sort of king would I be if I showed only weakness? She brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. A wise one, if it meant living. A flicker of old impatience, overshadowed by warmth, crossed Robb's face. He squeezed her hand gently. Then, turning to Brienne, he said, "Lead on. Let's see these hills you spoke of." They moved northwest, skirting farmland and crossing gentle ridges. The further they ventured from the main roads, the rougher the terrain. By midday, they reached a region of low mountains dotted with pine forests and winding paths that were little more than game trails. A thin drizzle began, turning the rocky soil into slippery mud. The men pulled their cloaks tighter, urging their horses onward as the rain pattered on iron helmets. Late in the afternoon, they came upon what looked like the remnants of a hunter's lodge, perched on a slope above a babbling stream. It was small, the roof half collapsed, but it had stout walls made of stacked stone. A deserted stable stood beside it, the rafters sagging. Brienne dismounted to check for signs of recent occupation, sword drawn. Catelyn and Robb watched from a short distance, along with a few guards. Inside the lodge, Brienne found only debris. Broken chairs, a rotten table, old furs riddled with moth holes. No footprints in the dust. It had probably been abandoned for a year or more, its owners fleeing the war or worse. It's safe enough, she told them. Not comfortable, but the walls are sturdy. The roof needs patching, but it'll keep most of the rain out. Catelyn eyed the building. It's out of the way. We could hide here for a time." Robb slid from his saddle, landing with a grimace. He leaned on Brienne's offered arm, catching his breath. "Good enough," he muttered, though a spark of relief flickered in his tired eyes. That evening, they cleared out the lodge's main room, disposing of debris and patching the worst holes in the roof with pine boughs. The stable was repaired enough to shelter the horses from the drizzle. Maester Catelyn scrounged a small pantry for any salvageable supplies, finding only a bit of moldy flour and some dried herbs. Nonetheless, it was shelter, a sanctuary from prying eyes. Soldiers posted watch at intervals along the ridge, from which they could glimpse the valley below. In the flicker of a few lanterns, the men lay down on bedrolls, and for the first time in weeks, some managed a true sleep unbroken by constant movement. Brienne remained awake late into the night, pacing the perimeter, listening to the hush of rain dripping from pine needles. She found a spot where she could see the faint glow of distant farmland. Her thoughts drifted to the Grachan's fate, the men risking their lives in those same farmlands. With any luck, the ruse was working, and the Freys were scouring the wrong countryside. A flash of lightning revealed the silhouette of towering mountains to the north. The roll of thunder soon followed. Brienne recalled Storm's End, her home, how storms there could rage for days. Here, the thunder was gentler, more distant, as though the heavens themselves walked quietly above these hills. She had never expected her life to be entwined with that of House Stark. Yet fate had led her to swear an oath to Catelyn, and in so doing, she had helped avert the complete annihilation that night. Now she was as bound to them as she had once been bound to Renly Baratheon, and there was no question in her mind. She would lay down her life for this cause if need be. 2 days passed in the lodge with no sign of danger. Robb's condition improved further under Maester Catelyn's care. He could walk short distances without aid, though his left arm remained weak. Brienne noticed that he grew restless, pacing the lodge's single intact room, asking for news. They had none. The Blackfish had yet to return, nor had any messenger arrived. It was possible he'd encountered trouble, or it might simply be that the journey was long. Worry hung over Catelyn and Robb like a shroud. On the third day, the rain cleared, leaving the pine-scented air crisp. Catelyn ventured outside to wash clothes in the stream, accompanied by a guard. Robb tried to join her, but after a few steps, he winced and returned inside to rest. Brienne busied herself repairing a broken shutter, using a dagger to whittle a brace. Halfway through her work, a sentry called from the ridge, "Riders approaching!" Every muscle in Brienne's body tensed. She grabbed her sword and raced up the slope. The guard pointed to a distant bend in the valley below. 3 riders emerged from the cover of trees, moving at a cautious pace. They bore no visible banners. Brienne squinted. "Could be brigands," the guard muttered, "or Freys in disguise." But as they came closer, Brienne glimpsed the man at the front. A cloak embroidered with a fish design. The Blackfish. Relief flooded her. She recognized his posture immediately. "It's Lord Brinden Tully," she told the guard. "Open the path for him, but keep watch in case there are others behind." Soon enough, the 3 riders arrived at the lodge's makeshift gate. The Blackfish swung down from the saddle, face lined with fatigue. His 2 companions, also Tully men, looked equally worn. "Any trouble while I was gone?" he asked without preamble, handing his reins to a guard. "None, my lord," Brienne answered. "Robb's healing. Come inside." They entered the lodge, crossing the threshold into the dim interior. Robb rose from a crude bench, bracing himself on a wall, while Catelyn, alerted by the commotion, hurried in from outdoors, drying her hands on her skirts. "Uncle Brinden," she said, eyes widening with hope. "Thank the gods you've returned safely. Did you find anything?" The Blackfish sighed, removing his gloves. "Some good news, some bad. The Mallisters remain resolute in their dislike of Fry. They might aid us quietly, but the Lannisters are pressing them hard from the south, and Walder Frey's men push from the east. The Mallisters dare not openly declare for Robb unless they believe he commands a significant force. They can't risk drawing the lion's wrath. Robb's face fell, though he tried to steady his expression. So they won't help us? Not openly, the Blackfish clarified. But Lord Mallister sent you this. He pulled a small pouch from his belt, tossing it onto the rickety table. Coins clinked. Some gold, enough to buy supplies or bribe a few watchmen. In addition, he'll provide a handful of archers, maybe 20. That's all he can spare without drawing suspicion. They'll arrive in a fortnight at a discreet location along the coast. Catelyn let out a soft breath. I suppose that's better than nothing. There's more, the Blackfish added. He grimaced, running a hand over his short beard. Rumors swirl that Walder Frey is furious you escaped. Robb, he's put a price on your head. 10,000 dragons for whoever delivers the king in the north, dead or alive. The same for Lady Catelyn. Bolton's men are also rumored to be searching for you in the north. They claim you're a traitor who broke guest right and murdered Frey men in cold blood. Lies, of course, but some fools may believe it. Robb clenched his good hand into a fist. Damn him. And Bolton. Catelyn's lips thinned. Let them spread lies. We know the truth. But the weight of the bounty was clear in her eyes. That kind of gold would tempt any Sellsword or desperate villager. We'll have to be even more cautious. The Blackfish nodded gravely. Aye, the Mallisters' gold will help us move and buy provisions discreetly. But it'll be small comfort if half the countryside hunts us. He took a seat on a stool, rubbing his neck. What of your plan to settle here for a time? It's as good a hiding place as any, I'll grant you that. We can't stay indefinitely, Robb said. But for now it offers sanctuary while I recover. Then I intend to gather what men we can, set up a network of riders to contact loyal lords, and eventually we retake Riverrun or at least free Edmure. A tremor of pain laced his voice. We can't just leave him there. Catelyn's expression flickered with guilt. He must think we abandoned him. Her eyes glistened. But I'll not let my brother rot. We must find a way. Brienne felt compelled to speak. Then you'll need more numbers. A fortress like the Twins is nearly impregnable without a proper siege, and we can't hope to mount that with our current force. True, Robb said, grimacing. But if we had an ally who could approach from behind, or if we found a weakness, perhaps a hidden water gate or postern we might attempt to rescue. It's madness, but I won't leave Edmure to die in Walder Frey's hands. The group exchanged glances. The notion of infiltrating the Twins again felt like stepping back into a nightmare. Yet the possibility of leaving Edmure to the Freys was equally unthinkable. The Blackfish inhaled, then spoke in a measured tone. If that's our goal, we need to plan carefully. We'll need men skilled in stealth, knowledge of the castle's layout, perhaps even the collusion of a discontented Frey. They aren't all loyal to Walder. Some might resent his tyranny. Catelyn's eyes lit with a faint spark of hope. We can plan. In time. But first, Robb must gather strength. The talk continued well into the evening, branching into speculation about possible traitors or hidden allies. Through it all, Brienne remained silent for the most part, absorbing the details. Each idea carried enormous risk, but at least they were not paralyzed by fear. Walder Frey had failed to kill them at the Twins, and so long as they drew breath, they refused to cede to despair. In the following days, life in that remote lodge found a certain rhythm. Robb continued exercises under Maester Colin's supervision, slowly regaining dexterity in his left arm. The men ventured on short patrols to map the surrounding hills. The Blackfish oversaw rationing and prepared for the arrival of the promised Mallister archers, though he knew they might not show if the roads proved too dangerous. Catelyn busied herself with letters writing messages that might be carried by trusted riders to lords she deemed sympathetic. She never sent them all at once, that would be too conspicuous. Instead, small groups of men departed every few days, carrying hidden pleas for aid or updates on the king in the North's survival. Brienne remained a constant sentinel, ensuring the lodge remained secure, leading a few men to build hidden lookouts. She taught some of them rudimentary sword drills, men who had been farmers a year ago now forced into soldiering for House Stark. She spoke little, but her presence commanded respect. After nights spent on watch, she would often patrol the perimeter alone, stepping through the thick pine needles, mindful of every broken twig. She had no illusions that their refuge was impenetrable, but at least it provided a vantage from which to see approaching threats. One cold morning, after she'd finished a pre-dawn circuit of the area, Brienne returned to find Robb outside the lodge, leaning against the stone wall. He was breathing heavily, having climbed the short slope behind the building. Catelyn stood at his side, her arm around his waist to steady him. They were both watching the sun rise over the far ridge, the sky painted with pink and gold. At the sound of Brienne's footsteps, they turned. Robb offered a faint smile. "You're an early riser, I see." Brienne inclined her head. "I wanted to be sure no one approached in the night." She noticed he'd made it further up the slope than ever before, which meant he was steadily growing stronger. "How do you feel?" He rolled his stiff shoulder. "Better. Still not as I was, but able to breathe without searing pain. I can hold a sword, though not well. Mother insists I not overdo it." He shot Catelyn a wry glance, and she arched a knowing brow in response. "You'll get there," Brienne assured him, then paused. "I could help you train, if you like. At least with sword forms." Robb's eyes lit with genuine interest. "You're a fine warrior, from all I've seen. I'd be honored to train with you." "Mother." He turned to Catelyn as if seeking her permission. She sighed. "Carefully, Robb. I don't want the stitches tearing." Brienne nodded. "We can start slow, simple stances." So it was decided. That morning, after breakfast, Brienne fetched 2 practice swords fashioned from weighted wood. She led Robb into a relatively flat clearing behind the lodge. The men assigned to watch in that sector found themselves with front-row seats to the unusual sight of a tall female knight drilling a young king who was recovering from grievous wounds. Robb managed a few basic parries and thrusts before pain forced him to pause. He fought through frustration, breathing heavily. Brienne kept her voice gentle, coaching him on stance and balance. Catelyn observed from a short distance, heart in her throat each time Robb winced. But the sparkle of determination in his eyes was heartening. "Enough for now," Brienne eventually declared, seeing how his arm shook from exertion. "Rest before you strain yourself." Robb nodded, setting aside the wooden blade. "I hate feeling this weak," he muttered, pressing a hand to his bandaged shoulder. "But I can feel it improving." "Small steps," Brienne said, handing him a waterskin. He drank deeply, sweat beading on his brow. From that day on, they trained in short sessions whenever Robb felt strong enough. Bit by bit, he regained speed and confidence. The men who watched took quiet inspiration from seeing their king persist despite pain. Some even joined in their own drills under Brienne's guidance, though she remained first and foremost Robb's teacher and protector. Nearly 2 weeks passed before a messenger arrived from the Mallisters bearing tidings that a party of archers would rendezvous in 3 days' time at a secluded glen to the west. Elation rippled through the camp. Though 20 archers was not an army, it felt like a first step toward building a true force. Robb, emboldened by progress in his recovery, proposed they greet the archers personally, show them that the king in the north lived and was resolute. The Blackfish and Catelyn debated the risk, eventually agreeing that a small escort with Robb might inspire more loyalty than mere rumor. Thus, on a crisp morning, they set out from the lodge, leaving a handful of men to maintain the fortifications. Robb rode near the front, posture straighter than before. Brienne flanked him, eyes scanning for threats. The Blackfish led the way, having memorized the route from the messenger. Catelyn, cloaked in gray and blue, kept close to her son. Maester Colin remained behind, trusting that Robb's injuries no longer required constant attention. If all went well, they'd be back in under a week with the new recruits. The journey took them through rolling hills adorned with pine and the occasional patch of oak. The smell of crisp leaves and distant wood smoke evoked a fleeting sense of autumnal peace, despite the underlying danger. They camped at dusk near a small stream, taking care to keep fire small and concealed. Brienne noticed that Robb's color had returned, and his humor, too, as he shared quiet jests with his mother. It was as though each league traveled away from the trauma of the twins allowed him to reclaim a fragment of himself. However, on the second day's ride, after cresting a wooded ridge, their scouts spotted a column of riders far below moving on a perpendicular path. The scouts signaled for everyone to halt. The Blackfish dismounted, peering through a spyglass. Brienne and Robb joined him, the king carefully sliding off his horse to crouch behind some brush. "I count at least 30 men," the Blackfish murmured. "Banners are furled, can't see who they serve." Robb frowned, shading his eyes with a hand. "We need to know if they're friend or foe. But we can't risk open contact." The Blackfish passed him the spyglass. Through it, Robb observed the riders. Many bore swords and crossbows. 1 or 2 wagons followed, possibly loaded with supplies. The armor and tack looked mismatched, suggesting they might be sellswords or brigands. Yet the caution was warranted. Any group that large might serve House Fry or the Boltons. "Let's circle around," Robb finally said, lowering the spyglass. "We've come too far to risk a fight for no gain." They steered clear of the riders, taking a longer route through dense forest. The day wore on, tension mounting with every snapping twig. By nightfall, they had not encountered further sign of the mysterious column, which was a relief, yet it served as a reminder that the roads were rife with threats. On the third day, they arrived at the designated glen, a small meadow surrounded by tall, swaying pines with a narrow creek running through. A hush settled over the group as they approached. If the Mallister archers were there, they would be waiting under cover. If they had not arrived, or if the arrangement was a trap, tension coiled in every muscle. Robb, at the Blackfish's suggestion, halted his men on the glen's edge. Only Brienne, Catelyn, and the Blackfish rode forward, Robb at the head, to show themselves openly in the clearing. The rest of their escort hung back among the pines, bows at the ready. The wind rippled the long grass, carrying the scent of damp earth. They waited, hearts pounding. Then movement among the trees on the far side, shapes emerging, bows in hand. A small group of archers, each wearing the falcon and trident sigil of House Mallister on their cloaks. They looked wary but not immediately hostile. One man, presumably their leader, stepped forward, calling, "Who goes there?" Robb hailed and urged his horse closer, stopping a good 10 paces away to avoid spooking them. In a clear voice, he said, "Robb Stark, king in the north, and you must be Lord Mallister's men." A ripple of shock passed through the archers at the name. The leader, a tall man with a trim beard, bowed his head. "We were told we might meet the young wolf here, though we scarcely believed it. My Lord Mallister sends his regards." "Your lord does us a great service," Catelyn interjected gently. "We thank him for your aid." The tension in the clearing ebbed. The leader introduced himself as Ser Martin Louis, a retainer of the Mallisters. He explained they had traveled in small groups to avoid detection, converging here at the glen. 20 archers, as promised. "We also bring some supplies, fletching, arrowheads, dried provisions. I fear it's not much, but Lord Mallister hopes it will help you continue your struggle." Robb managed a smile. Even a small help can turn the tide in time. The North remembers its friends. "We have a hidden camp in the hills. You'll be welcome there." Ser Martin eyed Robb's bandaged shoulder curiously but asked no direct questions about the king's health. Clearly, rumors of the Red Wedding's horrors had spread far. But that Robb was upright and speaking with authority lent weight to the notion that House Stark was not yet vanquished. With a few more cautious words exchanged, the two groups merged. Robb beckoned for his escort to join them, and soon the clearing was filled with men greeting one another in hushed tones. The Mallister archers seemed relieved to see that rumors of the king in the North's survival were indeed true. Ser Martin repeated that many in the Riverlands despised Walder Frey. "He's made himself into a petty tyrant, holed up in that cursed fortress. We're hearing rumors that even some of his kin resent his cruelty." Catelyn's eyes narrowed. "Frey family intrigues are a labyrinth, but if we can exploit any cracks in their unity, we might gain an advantage." The Blackfish nodded curtly. "Perhaps. For now, though, we should lead these men back to the lodge. It's not safe to linger." They set off by midday, moving in a tight column through winding forest paths. The archers kept their bows strung, scanning the trees. Twice, they heard distant hoofbeats or glimpsed plumes of dust, but they encountered no direct threat. By dusk, the glen lay far behind them, and the newly bolstered force made camp in a hollow sheltered by boulders. At the campfire, Ser Martin shared more details of the Mallisters' constraints. "House Mallister can't openly declare for you again, Your Grace, not until they see the possibility of a real victory. They fear retribution from the Lannisters. But you have their covert support for now. Perhaps if you can rally more houses, they'll take the risk." Robb accepted the words with grim understanding. "I appreciate what they've done. And in time, I hope we'll give them reason to stand at our side openly." Brienne watched the exchange quietly. She understood that these alliances were precarious. But precarious was better than nothing. Hope, once a tiny ember, now flared a little brighter with these new arrivals. 20 archers might not change the course of the war on their own, but combined with cunning and the northern resilience, they could be a spark to reignite the fight. When they finally returned to the lodge, the men left behind welcomed the Mallisters with cautious gratitude. The space was cramped now, forcing them to expand outward into tents around the slopes. Fortunately, the archers had brought a few sturdy canvas shelters. They erected these in a perimeter formation, each vantage point affording a clear line of sight down into the valley. A sense of purpose infused the camp. Soldiers drilled, built better defenses. The air smelled of pine resin, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of arrowheads. Robb himself, heartened by the new recruits, began holding more extensive training sessions. Though not fully recovered, he walked among the men, offering encouragement. He sometimes sparred carefully with Brienne, pushing his limits. Each blow of the practiced sword rang with the memory of the Red Wedding, forging a new determination in him. Catelyn watched from the sidelines, her posture straighter, her face set with quiet resolve. If Walder Frey had hoped to break House Stark's spirit, he had failed, at least for now. In the evenings, around the lodge's central fire, they spoke of the next steps. Contacting more disaffected riverlords, possibly sending riders north to glean the truth about Bolton's hold on Winterfell. Brienne listened closely, offering suggestions where she could. She reminded them that infiltration or rescue missions would require subtlety. She also pressed them to consider the timeline for Edmure's rescue. Would they attempt it soon, or first strengthen their position? Each question stirred debate, but no firm decisions were made. Time felt both friend and enemy. Robb needed more men to mount any real strike. Yet the longer they waited, the more risk Edmure faced. Word arrived in a letter from a covert courier that the Great John had been spotted skirmishing with Frey forces in the eastern Riverlands. He still led a band claiming the king in the north was among them, which had thus far distracted Walder Frey's main host. Relief spread through the lodge camp at this news. The ploy was working. It gave them further leeway to scheme and bolster their ranks. Still, the knowledge that the Greyjohn's men were fighting and dying to sustain this deception weighed heavily on Robb. Brienne noticed how he would grow quiet after hearing any new tidings of battles. She guessed he felt guilt that others risked their lives while he recovered in relative safety. Catelyn too bore that burden. "Our men bleed for us," she murmured to Brienne one morning, "and I cannot be there to share their danger. Feels so wrong." Brienne, ever frank, replied, "Sometimes leadership demands you remain behind, so you can lead another day." She recalled her own helpless fury the night of the Red Wedding, how they'd had no choice but to flee. Were seldom matched the honor-bound ideal they craved. That day, at Robb's request, Brienne led another training session in swordsmanship, archery, and shield work. The Mallister archers also participated, wanting to see if they could hone their melee skills. Robb watched intently, occasionally stepping in to correct a stance or demonstrate a parry, though he was still forced to fight mainly one-handed. The atmosphere rang with the clang of metal on metal, the hum of arrows striking targets. Beneath it, a quiet sense of camaraderie formed. It felt almost like the early days of Robb's campaign, when lords had rallied to the young wolf with hope in their hearts. Near dusk, Brienne noticed Robb standing alone by the edge of camp, gazing out at the sinking sun. She approached, boots crunching on pine needles. "Your Grace?" she asked gently. He turned, giving a faint smile. "Your help has been invaluable. My men respect you. They see how fiercely you fought at the Twins. They call you the Blue Sentinel." His smile turned wry. "I hope you don't mind." She blinked, heat rising to her cheeks. "I mind only that I fulfill my duty," she murmured. "Titles mean little to me." He nodded. "Duty. Sometimes it's all that keeps us going." His gaze flicked back to the horizon. "I can't stop thinking about the men who died that night. My vow to them was that we'd end this war with a free North. Instead, half my banner lords are dead or captured." Brienne laid a hand lightly on the hilt of her sword, uncertain what comfort to offer. "We cannot change the past. But you're alive, Your Grace, and you're rebuilding. That is the best way to honor their sacrifice." He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling. Yes, you're right. Each day we grow a little stronger thanks to the Greyjohn's ruse, the Mallisters' help, and you." She dipped her head. "I only serve my king." Silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken grief and determination. Then Catelyn called from behind, announcing that supper was ready. Together, they walked back to the lodge, the dusk light softening their silhouettes. In her mind, Brienne vowed anew that she would fight until her last breath to see them through. The Red Wedding had not claimed them all, and so long as their hearts still beat, they would press on against the looming tide of Lannisters, Freys, Boltons, any who sought to snuff out the legacy of House Stark. News reached them in dribs and drabs over the subsequent weeks. Some brought hope. Pockets of Riverlanders resisted Frey control. Sabotage of Frey supply lines near Seaguard had forced them to divert troops. Others were bleak. The Boltons reportedly tightened their grip on the north, sowing terror to keep the northern houses cowed. Winter itself grew closer, each dawn slightly colder, each gust of wind a reminder that the season would come, unstoppable. The men busied themselves fortifying the lodge's perimeter and drilling incessantly. Small squads ventured out on raids against minor Frey outposts, returning with meager spoils but valuable experience. Robb, now able to wield a sword with some competence again, led one such raid personally. Catelyn was anxious, but Brienne rode at his side. Under cover of darkness, they ambushed a small fry encampment that had been harassing local villagers. The skirmish was swift and brutal. The Freys, taken by surprise, were cut down or fled. When it was over, Robb stood amid the carnage, breathing heavily, sword dripping with blood. Brienne watched him carefully, ready to intervene if he showed signs of overexertion. But he steadied himself, turning to his men with fierce pride. The victory, though small, invigorated them. In the aftermath, they freed several caged villagers. One older man knelt at Robb's feet, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Lord, your grace," he said, trembling. "We thought the Starks were all dead." Robb helped him to his feet. "Not all," he said quietly. "And we fight on." That moment burned itself into Brienne's memory. She saw again how a single spark of hope could reignite entire communities battered by war. The stories of Walder Frey's treachery had spread like wildfire, but so had whispers that the king in the north still lived, moving unseen through the riverlands. And each day, that rumor found new believers. But none of that diminished the danger. Walder Frey had not given up. Bolton's men occasionally drifted south, searching for signs of the Stark survivors. Tywin Lannister loomed in King's Landing, his plots extending far beyond the capital. The lines of war had blurred, replaced by a scattering of feuds, raids, and betrayals across a fractured land. In this turbulent landscape, the battered remnant of House Stark clung to life like a lone pine on a windswept crag, unyielding despite the storms. Weeks turned to months, the lodge transforming from a crude shelter into a fortified hideout. More archers filtered in from Mallister lands. A few lords sympathetic. To the Tullus sent word that they, too, despised Walder Frey, though caution stayed their hand. The Greyjoy's men continued to lead the Freys on chases across the eastern tracts of the Riverlands, sowing confusion. By late autumn, Robb's host numbered nearly 300 fighting men, still not enough to challenge the might of the Freys head-on, but enough to mount coordinated strikes or attempt infiltration. And that was precisely what took shape in their councils, a plan to infiltrate the twins and rescue Edmure Tully. It began as a whispered hope, then evolved into a serious proposal as the Blackfish and Robb pored over old maps. Brienne contributed her perspective on infiltration, gleaned from the illusions she'd observed at the Red Wedding. If Walder Frey believed Robb was harassing him in the east, perhaps a small strike team could slip into the castle from the west, navigating the labyrinthine corridors. They would need loyal men, cunning, and a measure of luck. The last time they had set foot there, the Freys had nearly obliterated them. But the desire to save Edmure and strike a blow at Frey's pride was a powerful motivator. Robb, Catelyn, and the Blackfish debated the timing. Winter was at the doorstep, which complicated travel. The rivers might freeze, or at least run dangerously cold. But that could also hamper Frey's ability to bring in reinforcements. If the infiltration was successful, it might sow chaos within the twins and inspire more lords to join the Stark cause. If it failed, the cost in lives could be catastrophic. Ultimately, they decided to attempt it once the Greyjoy's next missive arrived, to coordinate with him. The plan was not set in stone, but the wheels were turning. Meanwhile, the camp braced itself for the turning of the season. Thick furs were distributed and hunts for game became a priority. Snow had not yet fallen, but the nights grew bitterly cold. Brienne took her turns on watch, each breath fogging the air, listening for the slightest sound that might signal an approaching force. More than once, she thought she heard the distant howling of wolves, and it reminded her of the dire wolf that had once fought by Robb's side. Grey Wind, lost in the Red Wedding's carnage. That memory still kindled her rage. One evening, as she was preparing to patrol the perimeter, Catelyn approached, face pensive. "Walk with me, Brienne," she said. The two moved through the pines, the moonlight casting silver patterns on the ground. "I wanted to say," Catelyn paused, folding her arms. Her breath plumed in the chill air. "I wanted to thank you again for all you've done for us. You could have left long ago, yet you remain." Brienne met her gaze, seeing the flicker of raw emotion beneath Catelyn's calm. "My place is here, with you," she said simply. "I promised I would see you and your son safe. That promise still stands." Catelyn's eyes glistened. "You've saved us 100 times over, Brienne. When I think of that night at the Twins, I can't express the depth of my gratitude nor the sorrow I carry for those who died." Brienne dipped her head, her own voice hushed. "I wish we could have saved them all, but I'll keep saving as many as I can for as long as I can." Catelyn reached out, squeezing Brienne's hand. The gesture spoke volumes of the bond that had grown between them. "The realm needs more knights like you," she whispered. Brienne felt warmth bloom in her chest, a sense of belonging she had seldom known. "I only hope to honor the memory of those we lost," she murmured. They walked on in comfortable silence, the pine needles crunching underfoot until they reached the edge of the ridge. Below, the lodge's lanterns flickered amid the gloom, silhouettes of men on watch. Catelyn exhaled slowly. "We will make Walder Frey answer for his treachery," she said, quiet yet firm. "Whatever it takes, we will not let that monstrous night be the end of our story." Brienne nodded, gazing out at the dark landscape. "Whatever it takes," she agreed. Thus, the seeds of vengeance and justice were sown deeper. Snow would come soon, blanketing the riverlands, making movement perilous, but House Stark lived. Catelyn Stark lived. Robb Stark lived. And Brienne of Tarth stood as their sworn guardian, a tall, unyielding shield against the tide of betrayal. Beneath the frosty moonlight, the vow she carried weighed upon her, but she shouldered it without complaint. For in a realm where so many vows were broken, hers remained as strong as the steel she bore. Days passed, then weeks, each marked by the interplay of hope and dread. Scouts brought rumors of the Greyjoy's success in drawing Frey forces away from the west. The infiltration plan gained traction. Under the Blackfish's watchful eye, a small strike team was assembled, men adept at climbing, at moving unseen. Brienne herself was among the first chosen. Robb insisted on it, for he trusted few as much as he trusted her to protect his mother and himself if it came to that. The mission's details were hammered out by firelight, a swirl of maps, and whispered speculation. They would approach the twins from the western bank, cross the Green Fork at a lesser-known ferry crossing once the Watchers were neutralized, then creep close to the walls. If a rumor the Blackfish had gleaned proved true, there might be a disused sally port on the southwestern tower. A single infiltrator could slip inside, open the postern gate for the rest. From there, they would search for Edmure, free him if possible, and escape before the alarm spread. The prospect of returning to that accursed fortress made Brienne's stomach churn. She remembered every stone corridor stained with the memory of betrayal. But the chance to strike a blow at Walder Frey, to save Edmure and restore some measure of justice stirred her blood. If the gods were good, they might succeed where the Red Wedding had sought to crush them. Catelyn, though anxious, accepted the plan. She insisted on remaining behind at the lodge with the bulk of their force, for fear of a second betrayal that might claim her son. Robb, however, intended to lead. "I will not hide," he stated resolutely, ignoring his mother's protests. "I've healed enough to wield a sword, and if Edmure sees me come for him, it might renew his will." Catelyn's face tightened with fear, but she knew better than to forbid him. She simply turned to Brienne and said, "Swear to me you'll keep him safe." Brienne met her gaze squarely, nodding. "On my honor, my lady." And so the stage was set. On a cold morning with low clouds skimming the mountaintops, the infiltration party departed the lodge, leaving Catelyn behind with clenched fists and a fragile prayer on her lips. Robb, the Blackfish, Brienne, and a select group of 24 men rode in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. The sun was little more than a pale disk behind gray haze, offering scant warmth. They carried rope, grapnels, rations for a week. Armor was kept light or padded with cloaks to muffle sound. The plan demanded stealth above all else. They traveled north by winding paths, skirting farmland until they reached the broad plains that stretched toward the Green Fork. The closer they came to the river, the more the memories of that fateful night pressed upon them. Robb's expression grew grim, his eyes flicking over every farmhouse or cluster of trees as if expecting crossbow bolts to fly from hidden corners. Brienne kept near him, scanning for threats, every sense on edge. The men spoke little, consumed by the magnitude of what they intended. A hush lay on the land as though the realm itself held its breath. By dusk on the third day, they spotted the wide, dark ribbon of the Green Fork ahead, the water swirling with winter's chill. A scattering of flurries drifted from the sky, melting on armor and cloaks. The ferry crossing that the Blackfish recalled was upstream from the twins, a dilapidated barge tethered to a rope system. A handful of old huts stood near the riverbank, presumably for the ferrymen or any travelers passing the seldom-used route. With caution, they crept closer. The huts appeared empty, smoke-stained but deserted. The ferry barge still floated, though it creaked ominously when tested. One soldier cursed under his breath that rope might snap under too much weight. The Blackfish stoic said, "We'll cross in small groups. Keep a watch on the far bank." Night was fully upon them by the time the crossing began. The men boarded in groups of 5 or 6, hauling themselves across by means of the rope strung between banks. The water churned darkly below, the barge listing alarmingly whenever someone shifted. Brienne felt her pulse hammer each time the barge tilted. If they capsized in these frigid waters, half their band might drown or be swept away to the waiting mercy of the twins. Yet one by one, each group reached the opposite shore safely. Robb insisted on crossing near the end to ensure his men went first. Brienne accompanied him, her gloved hands straining on the rope, arms trembling with exertion. The barge lurched with every wave. A freezing wind cut across the river, biting into their bones. Eventually, they made it, stumbling onto the muddy shore. The men inhaled shaky breaths, grateful to be alive. The ferry barge was left moored to the far side in hopes of a quick retreat if needed. Clouds obscured the moon, giving them cover but also plunging them into near darkness. They lit no torches, relying on minimal lanterns shielded by cloaks. With hushed voices, the Blackfish guided them southward along the west bank toward the Twins. Here, the tension heightened. The fortress was not yet in sight, but they all knew its imposing shape loomed somewhere ahead, spanning both sides of the river with its twin towers and the bridge between. The land lay flat, offering little natural cover. They would approach on foot, dividing into smaller squads to reduce the chance of detection. Snow flurries continued to swirl, dusting the ground in pale powder. Their boots crunched softly, muffled by damp earth. Rob's breath was ragged, but he pressed on, refusing any suggestion to rest. Brienne could see the determination in his eyes. He would see his uncle freed or die trying. As they drew closer, they found a small dip in the terrain that offered partial concealment. Beyond it, lights flickered on the ramparts of the Twins, a faint outline of the formidable towers. The men hunkered down, conferring in whispers. The plan was to circle wide, come at the southwestern tower from behind. If luck held, the Freys would have minimal patrols there, focusing instead on the main gates and the eastern approach where they expected any real threat. They began the slow, painstaking crawl through the darkness, each soldier mindful of every footstep. The snow picked up, drifting in angled sheets that stung their eyes. It provided some cover but also hampered visibility. Brienne felt her heart pound so loudly she feared the Freys might hear it from the battlements. The memory of crossbow bolts whistling inside that hall flashed through her mind. She clenched her jaw, forging ahead. At last, the southwestern wall rose before them, dark stone glimmering with a thin veil of frost. Torchlight glowed above, but the watch seemed minimal, only a couple of silhouettes pacing along the rampart. The Blackfish signaled for the men to wait. Then, with infinite care, he, Brienne, and two others crept forward to where they expected to find the rumored sally port. They ran gloved hands along the stone, searching for seams. For agonizing moments, Brienne found nothing but icy mortar. Then, suddenly, her fingers brushed a slight indent. A soldier pulled a short pry bar from his pack, inserting it carefully into a gap. The stone groaned, but they managed to wedge it open a crack. Inside, blackness yawned. The soldier exhaled in relief. So far, no alarm sounded. The next step involved unlatching or disabling the bar that might lock this hidden door from within. Another tense minute passed, each second an eternity. At last, there was a faint click and the door opened enough for a body to slip through.